Why was Solomon chosen by God to construct his temple when David, described as a man after God's own heart, was refused this privilege? What qualities made this temple so extraordinary that its destruction brought a whole nation to collapse? And in what way did a structure become the connection point between the divine realm and earthly existence? If you found yourself curious about the full account of Solomon's temple, from the precise instructions given by God to its spectacular building process, from its peak of splendor to what ultimately happened to it, you've arrived at precisely the right destination. We're preparing to explore one of biblical history's most captivating chapters. Before any stone was placed upon another stone, before any cedar made contact with gold, there came thunder. The variety that rolls through mountain ranges and finds its home deep within human souls. This thunder conveyed a promise destined to resound across the centuries. But before we get started, if this channel is new to you, think about pressing that like button and subscribing if you're not already a subscriber. Your support allows us to keep creating these kinds of videos to help you discover something new or enjoy your time. Additionally, share with us your location and the current time where you are. We're cultivating a worldwide community here, so you can discover and interact with people who share your interests from every corner of the globe in the comments section below. The thunder that came before the temple. Imagine the garden. Eden flourished in perfection beneath primordial skies. Adam communed with God during the cool evening hours. Nothing created separation between the heavenly and earthly realms. Divine presence moved like flowing water through each leaf, through every breath. Yet humanity selected a different direction. The garden sealed itself. The presence retreated behind cherubim and swords wreathed in flame. Still, God's heart stayed constant. The longing to live among people continued burning steadfast as the stars. What came next was an extended, patient romance between the heavenly and earthly realms. Moses ascended Sinai's rough slopes. Lightning fractured the darkness. Thunder rattled the mountain until its foundations smoked like a furnace. God came down in fire. The people shook in the valley beneath, pleading with Moses to serve as their spokesman. They found themselves unable to withstand the direct contact with holiness. Yet something wonderful came forth from that fear. God provided detailed blueprints for the tabernacle. Each measurement held significance. Each fabric and metal conveyed purpose. The portable sanctuary was designed to journey with wandering Israel. God intended to reside in their midst, though concealed behind curtains. The tabernacle contained mysteries within mysteries. The holy place glowed with lampstands of gold. Bread of the presence rested on acacia wood tables. Incense ascended from bronze altars, yet deeper still rested the Holy of Holies. A single man entered a single time each year. The high priest would draw back the veil and position himself before the Ark of the Covenant. The Ark itself resisted simple explanation. Gold overlaid acacia wood, cherubim extended wings above the mercy seat. Within it lay stone tablets Moses brought down from sea. Aaron's staff that had budded, a jar of manna from the wilderness days. These items throbbed with divine energy. The ark symbolized God's throne upon earth. When Israel moved forward, the ark blazed the trail. Rivers split before it. City walls fell at its presence. Yet the ark required reverence. Those who handled it without care dropped dead. It bore both blessing and judgment in equal portions. The tabernacle fulfilled its function admirably. Across generations it traveled with the tribes. From wilderness to conquest, from judges to kings, the tent of meeting stayed central to Israel's identity. Yet tents grow threadbare. Fabrics deteriorate. The portable sanctuary spoke of traveling, not arriving. David was destined to change everything. This shepherd king gazed at his cedar palace and experienced shame. He resided in luxury while God inhabited goat hair and ram skins. The thought disrupted his rest. God merited something better. Israel required something lasting, something magnificent. Yet the path to the temple started long before David's arrival. Every prayer lifted in the tabernacle was a brick placed in its foundation. Every sacrifice pointed toward greater glory yet to come. The thunder that rattled Sinai was the identical thunder that would one day fill Solomon's temple. God's longing to dwell among people had never diminished. It had only intensified with time. The stage stood ready. The participants were assuming their positions. The temple would ascend not as human ambition, but as divine invitation. Heaven was making preparations to touch earth in ways the world had never witnessed. David's dream. Goliath's body hit the ground with the sound of timber falling. The boy carrying the sling transformed into legend in that singular moment. Yet legends create long shadows. David's journey to the throne would prove more dangerous than any battlefield. Saul's jealousy burned with fever's intensity. The king who once cherished David now pursued him through wilderness caves. For years, David fled. He assembled outcasts and men burdened by debt who became his mighty warriors. They survived by their wits and God's protection. The future king discovered patience while in exile. When Saul ultimately fell on his sword at Mount Gilboa, David did not rejoice. He ripped his garments and grieved. The man who had attempted to end his life received honor in death. This was David's character, fierce when fighting, tender in triumph. The tribes assembled at Hebron. Oil flowed over David's head as he knelt before the elders. At 30, the shepherd transformed into king, yet his kingdom was divided. Judah followed David. The northern tribes crowned Saul's remaining son. Civil war extended across the land like a gaping wound. 7 years elapsed before David's enemies became silent. Unity arrived at a cost calculated in blood. Yet, when it arrived, it transformed everything. The scattered tribes became a nation. The nation became an empire. Jerusalem altered the game completely. The city perched on Mount Zion like a crown jewel. Jebusites had controlled it for centuries, ridiculing anyone who attempted to approach their mountain fortress. Yet David perceived what others overlooked. Whoever commanded Jerusalem commanded the crossroads of the ancient world. The conquest proved swift and clever. David's men crawled through water tunnels while the defenders monitored the walls. By sunrise, David's banner flew from the tallest tower. The city of David came into being. Yet Jerusalem provided something beyond military advantage. It belonged to no individual tribe, neutral territory where all 12 could assemble. A capital that unified rather than separated. David relocated his court to the mountain city and transformed it into the pulsing heart of Israel. The Ark of the Covenant had waited sufficiently long in obscurity. David commanded its return to Jerusalem with celebration that shook the mountains. Priests transported the sacred chest while thousands danced. David himself leaped before the Lord until his royal robes flew wild. His wife Michal observed from a palace window, ashamed of her husband's abandon. Yet David cared nothing for dignity when God was receiving honor. The ark discovered rest in a simple tent David constructed in Jerusalem. Now the king could approach God's dwelling whenever he desired. The closeness awakened something profound in David's heart. He resided in a palace of cedar and stone. God resided in curtains that flapped with every breeze. One evening, as rain drummed on the palace roof, David summoned Nathan the prophet. His words poured out like water from a broken dam. I reside in a house of cedar, yet the ark of God remains in a tent. This situation cannot continue. God deserves a dwelling worthy of his glory, a temple that will cause the nations to marvel. Nathan's initial response was enthusiasm. Do whatever is in your heart, for the Lord is with you. The prophet recognized the righteousness of the request. Surely God would bless such devotion. Yet that night, the word of the Lord came to Nathan. The message was not what either man anticipated. God had never requested a house of stone. Throughout all the wilderness years, through conquest and victory, the tent had served adequately. When the time arrived for a temple, God would select the builder. The divine response carried both correction and promise. David had waged many wars. His hands bore the stain of blood. Peace, not violence, would construct God's house. Yet David's son would occupy the throne. That son would build the temple David envisioned. The king received the news with surprising grace. He could have raged against the postponement. Instead, he bowed before the Lord in gratitude. If he could not construct the temple, he would make preparations for it. David began collecting materials with the passion of a man possessed. The dream continued living, stronger than ever. God had not rejected the temple. He had simply selected a different builder. David's warrior heart would discover peace in preparation. The house of God would ascend, even if David would not survive to see it finished. Solomon, the golden heir, the baby born to Bathsheba, should have perished. Court intrigue swirled around his cradle like hungry vultures. Older brothers with stronger claims plotted in palace shadows. Yet Nathan the prophet whispered a secret name over the child, Jedediah, beloved of the Lord. Solomon developed in a house where wisdom and politics danced together. David aged on his throne, yet his mind stayed sharp as a blade. The old king observed his sons carefully. Absalom had died in rebellion, his beauty twisted by ambition. Amnon fell to his brother's revenge. One by one, David's heirs revealed their true character. Yet Solomon was different. The boy asked questions that made grown men pause. He listened more than he spoke. When others grasped for power, Solomon observed how power moved. David recognized something in his son that reminded him of himself at that age. Not the warrior's fire, yet the shepherd's patient heart. Bathsheba carried secrets that could topple kingdoms. Her marriage to David began in scandal that never completely faded. Court gossips whispered about the night the king saw her bathing from his rooftop. They spoke of Uriah the Hittite, sent to die in battle so David could claim his wife. Yet Bathsheba's true power rested not in past shame, but in present influence. David loved her with the deep affection of a man who had learned the cost of his desires. When David's health began to decline, the palace became a battlefield of whispered alliances. Adonijah, David's surviving eldest son, moved first. He gathered supporters and declared himself king at a feast outside Jerusalem. The sound of celebration drifted over the city walls like a challenge. Nathan the prophet moved swiftly. He discovered Bathsheba in her chambers and spoke with urgent clarity. Have you not heard that Adonijah has become king while our Lord David does not know it? Come, allow me to give you counsel that you may save your own life and the life of your son Solomon. The plan was simple and brilliant. Bathsheba would remind David of his oath that Solomon would succeed him. Nathan would arrive moments later to confirm the crisis. Together, they would force the aging king to act. Bathsheba entered David's chamber, where he lay weak yet alert. Her words were measured and desperate. My lord, you swore by the Lord your God to your servant, saying, Solomon your son shall reign after me. Yet now Adonijah is king, and you do not know it. He has sacrificed oxen and fattened cattle and sheep in abundance, and has invited all the sons of the king and the commanders of the army, and Abiathar the priest. They are eating and drinking before him, and saying, Long live King Adonijah. Yet he did not invite me, your servant, or Zadok the priest, or Benaiah, or your servant Solomon. Before David could respond fully, Nathan appeared at the door. The prophet's confirmation struck like lightning. The crisis was genuine. Adonijah's supporters grew by the hour. If David did not act immediately, both Solomon and Bathsheba would likely face execution as soon as Adonijah secured power. David's response revealed why he had ruled so long and so well. Despite his physical weakness, his mind cut through the confusion like a sword. He summoned his most trusted servants and gave clear commands. Solomon would be crowned that very day, not in some distant ceremony, yet immediately with full royal honors. The procession to Gihon's spring unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance. Zadok the priest carried the horn of oil from the tabernacle. Benaiah led David's personal guard. Solomon rode the king's own mule, a symbol that transferred authority as surely as a crown. The horn blast that announced his anointing echoed off Jerusalem's walls and reached the ears of Adonijah's celebration. The competing feast dissolved in panic. Adonijah's supporters scattered like leaves in a storm. The would-be king himself fled to the horns of the altar, grasping for sanctuary. Solomon's first act as king showed the wisdom that would define his reign. Instead of executing his rival brother, he offered mercy with conditions. If he proves himself a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the earth. Yet if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. The transfer of power was complete. David had kept his promise to Bathsheba and secured his son's future. Yet the real work was just beginning. Solomon inherited an empire at its peak, yet empires require different skills than kingdoms. The warrior king had given way to one who would need to rule through wisdom rather than strength. As David prepared for his final rest, he called Solomon to his side. The old king's last words were part blessing, part warning. Be strong and show yourself a man. Keep the charge of the Lord your God, walking in his ways and keeping his statutes, his commandments, his rules, and his testimonies. Then you will prosper in all that you do and wherever you turn. The golden age was about to begin, yet gold can shine brilliantly and still be tested by fire. Solomon would discover that divine blessing and human wisdom must work together if the throne was to endure. Blueprint from heaven. The dream came like thunder wrapped in light. Solomon lay sleeping on his royal bed when heaven opened above him. God himself stood in the chamber, not as distant deity yet as friend, offering the deepest gift possible. Ask what I shall give you. The young king could have requested anything. Armies that never lose, riches beyond counting, a life that stretches through centuries. Yet Solomon's heart revealed its true nature in that sacred moment. Give your servant an understanding heart to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this great people of yours? God's pleasure at the request filled the dream with warmth. The king had asked for wisdom to serve others, rather than power to serve himself. Therefore, he would receive not only wisdom, yet also riches and honor beyond any king before or after him. The dream faded, yet its gift remained. When Solomon woke, he knew everything had changed. The weight of divine blessings settled on his shoulders like a mantle woven from starlight. His first test came swiftly. 2 women stood before his throne, both claiming the same baby as their own. The dead child lay between them as evidence of a tragedy that could not be undone. The case seemed impossible to judge. No witnesses, no evidence beyond the tears of mothers. Yet wisdom moved through Solomon like water through a channel. His solution was both terrible and brilliant. Bring me a sword, divide the living child in 2, and give half to the one and half to the other. The false mother nodded in grim satisfaction. If she could not have the child, neither should her rival. Yet the true mother's heart broke at the suggestion. Please, my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death. Love revealed itself in her willingness to surrender, rather than see harm come to her son. Solomon's judgment became legend within hours. The baby went to his real mother. The people of Israel heard what had happened and felt awe toward their king. Divine wisdom had come to dwell among them in the person of their ruler. Yet God had greater plans than settling disputes between mothers. One night as Solomon prayed in the palace, the Lord spoke again. This time the message concerned the temple David had dreamed of building. The time had come. The plan would be revealed. What followed was instruction that made Mount Sinai seem simple by comparison. Every measurement carried meaning. Every material spoke of divine purpose. The temple would not merely be a building, yet a bridge between heaven and earth, carefully designed to channel God's presence into the world. The site itself held deep significance. Mount Moriah rose north of David's city like an altar built by giants. Abraham had climbed this same mountain centuries before, carrying wood and fire for a sacrifice that tested his faith to its limits. Here, Isaac had lain bound on stone while his father raised the knife. Here, the angel of the Lord had provided a ram in the thicket and sworn by God's own name that blessing would flow to all nations through Abraham's seed. David had purchased the mountain from Araunah the Jebusite during a plague that swept Jerusalem. The king had refused to offer God something that cost him nothing. Full price was paid for every stone and clod of earth. Now Solomon would transform that ancient threshing floor into the dwelling place of the Most High. The dimensions revealed perfect harmony. The temple would stretch 60 cubits long, 20 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. These numbers were not arbitrary, yet reflected divine mathematics that governed creation itself. The building would face east toward the rising sun, its entrance welcoming light as it banished darkness. 3 distinct areas would divide the sacred space. The porch, or vestibule, would serve as threshold between common and holy ground. The holy place would house the golden altar of incense, the table for bread of the presence, and 10 golden lampstands that would burn continually. Yet, deepest of all lay the Holy of Holies, a perfect cube, 20 cubits, in every direction. Here the Ark of the Covenant would rest in darkness, thick with presence. The interior design revealed layer upon layer of meaning. Cedar wood would line every wall, carved with flowers and palm trees and cherubim that seemed almost alive. Gold would cover everything, transforming the inner chambers into caverns of light. The floors themselves would gleam with golden boards fitted together without gaps. Yet the most striking feature would be the great bronze pillars that flank the entrance. Each would rise 18 cubits high, crowned with capitals carved like lilies blooming from bronze. Their names would be Jachin and Boaz, establishment and strength. Together they would proclaim that this house was built to endure until the end of time. The courtyard would extend the sacred space outward in carefully measured stages. Here priests would offer daily sacrifices on the great bronze altar. The bronze sea, a massive basin held aloft by 12 bronze oxen, would provide water for ritual cleansing. 10 smaller lavers on wheeled stands would serve the daily needs of temple service. Solomon studied every detail until they burned in his memory like brands. The temple would be more than architecture. It would be theology made visible, a place where earth and heaven met in harmony. Every stone would sing of God's glory. Every golden surface would reflect divine light into human darkness. The blueprint was complete. Now came the harder task of transforming vision into reality. Yet, Solomon felt no fear as he contemplated the work ahead. God had given the plan. God would provide the means. The house of the Lord would rise on Mount Moriah as surely as the sun rose each morning in the east. A kingdom mobilized. Dawn broke over Jerusalem to the sound of hammers and saws. Solomon's dream had become the empire's obsession. Every corner of the kingdom buzzed with preparation. The temple would not rise through royal decree alone, yet through the coordinated effort of an entire nation awakening to its destiny. The numbers defied imagination. 30,000 men would serve in rotating shifts, 10,000 at a time, traveling north to Lebanon. There they would work alongside Hiram's skilled lumbermen, cutting cedars that had grown for centuries on the mountain slopes. Each month, a fresh rotation would journey to the forests, while the previous shift returned home to tend their families and fields. Yet logging was only the beginning. 70,000 porters would carry the massive stones and timber from quarries and forests to Jerusalem. Their paths crisscrossed the kingdom like veins carrying lifeblood to the heart. 80,000 stonecutters would shape blocks in quarries far from the temple site, ensuring that no sound of hammer or chisel would disturb the sacred mountain during construction. The logistics required wisdom that matched the architecture, food for over 100,000 workers, tools that would not break under constant use, animals to carry loads that would crush human backs. Solomon's administrators worked through the night planning supply routes and storage facilities. The kingdom's entire infrastructure bent toward a single purpose. King Hiram of Tyre received Solomon's message with delight. The Phoenician ruler had loved David like a brother. Now the son would continue that friendship with terms that enriched both kingdoms. Solomon's proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Israel had grain and olive oil in abundance. Tyre commanded the sea and controlled the finest craftsmen in the known world. Each kingdom possessed what the other needed most. Hiram's response exceeded Solomon's hopes. Not only would Tyre provide cedar and cypress wood, yet the king would send his master craftsman. This man bore the same name as the king himself and carried skills that bordered on the miraculous. He could work bronze and iron, silver and gold, stone and wood, purple and blue and crimson fabrics and fine linen. Whatever Solomon could imagine, this craftsman could create. The forest of Lebanon began to echo with the crash of falling giants. Cedars that had watched empires rise and fall surrendered to Phoenician axes. Each tree was chosen for specific purposes. The largest and straightest would become the temple's main beams. Smaller logs would frame the interior chambers. Even the sawdust had value, mixed with other materials to create the incense that would burn on golden altars. The mountains themselves yielded their secrets to Solomon's quarrymen. Limestone blocks emerged from hillsides north of Jerusalem. Each stone cut to precise measurements before leaving the quarry. The finest marble came from distant regions where men had never seen the temple site, yet labored with the knowledge that their work would glorify the God of Israel. Transport required engineering that matched the temple's complexity. Massive ox carts carried stones that weighed several tons each. Teams of animals worked in relay, resting at stations built specifically for the temple project. When roads proved inadequate, new ones were carved through hills and valleys. Bridges spanned ravines that had never known human crossing. Jerusalem itself transformed under the invasion of materials and workers. Temporary housing sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Markets expanded to feed the growing population. Workshops multiplied as local craftsmen learned techniques from foreign masters. The city's boundaries stretched outward, encompassing villages that had been separate for centuries. The economic impact rippled across the known world. Solomon's agents traveled to Ophir for gold, to Tarshish for silver, to distant lands whose names were whispered like prayers. Caravans approached Jerusalem from every direction, their loads destined for the temple treasury. The kingdom's wealth concentrated on Mount Moriah like water flowing toward the sea. Yet not everyone celebrated the mobilization. The northern tribes grumbled about forced labor that took their young men from farming and trade. Elders remembered Saul's warnings about the cost of kings who lived in luxury while their subjects struggled. Solomon's wisdom would be tested not only in building the temple, yet in managing the resentment that such massive projects inevitably created. The king walked among the workers whenever possible, sharing their labors and listening to their concerns. His presence reminded everyone that this was not vanity construction, yet divine commission. They were not building for Solomon, yet for the God who had delivered their ancestors from Egypt and given them a land flowing with milk and honey. Month by month, the materials accumulated on Mount Moriah. Stone blocks formed geometric patterns that would soon become walls and columns. Cedar logs lay in carefully organized rows, their fragrance filling the air with promise. Gold and silver waited in secured chambers, ready to transform plain surfaces into mirrors of heaven itself. The kingdom had become a single organism with one purpose. Every skill, every resource, every hour of labor focused on creating something that had never existed before. The dwelling place of God was taking shape, not just in the stones and timber being assembled, yet in the hearts of people who had caught a glimpse of divine glory and would not rest until it found physical expression. The stage was set. The materials were ready. Now, skilled hands would transform preparation into reality. 7 years of glory. The first stone settled into place with the whisper of ancient prophecy fulfilled. No hammers rang on Mount Moriah. No chisels sang against stone. The temple rose in silence that spoke louder than thunder. Each perfectly shaped block finding its destined position, like pieces of a puzzle designed before the world began. Solomon stood on the eastern slope, watching his vision take physical form. The foundation stones were marvels in themselves, some stretching 15 feet in length and 8 feet in height. They had been cut in distant quarries with such precision that no mortar was needed. Each stone locked against its neighbors with the certainty of divine mathematics. The walls climbed skyward with deliberate grace. Local limestone formed the core, yet this rough beauty would never be seen. Cedar boards from Lebanon covered every interior surface, their grain flowing like water frozen in wood. The cedar had been selected not just for beauty, yet for its resistance to decay and insects. These walls would stand until the end of time. The holy place took shape as the workers moved with quiet reverence. Here, golden lampstands would cast their glow on walls that gleamed like captured sunlight. The altar of incense would send sweet smoke toward heaven through windows that opened to the sky. The table for bread of the presence would hold loaves that connected earth's harvest to heaven's abundance. Yet it was the Holy of Holies that truly tested the craftsman's skill. This perfect cube would house the Ark of the Covenant in darkness so complete that only faith could navigate its depths. The walls were lined with cedar, then overlaid with pure gold that reflected no earthly light, yet seemed to generate its own inner radiance. 2 massive cherubim dominated the Holy of Holies, their wings spanning the entire width of the chamber. Carved from olive wood and covered in gold, they stood 10 cubits high, with wings that touched above the mercy seat. These were not the decorative angels of later tradition, yet awesome beings whose faces combined human intelligence, leonine strength, bovine service, and eagle swiftness. They guarded the throne of God with expressions that conveyed both love and terror. The interior decoration revealed artistic genius, guided by divine inspiration. Palm trees covered the walls, their fronds reaching toward carved flowers that never wilted. Gourds and open flowers created patterns that seemed to move in lamplight. Every surface told the story of Eden restored, of paradise regained through divine presence among his people. The temple's dimensions created perfect acoustics for worship. Voices lifted in the holy place carried clearly, yet never echoed harshly. The sound of priestly footsteps whispered rather than clattered. Even silence itself seemed richer here, pregnant with possibilities that stretched beyond human understanding. Golden chains stretched across the entrance to the Holy of Holies, marking the boundary between accessible and forbidden. Only the high priest would pass beyond this barrier, and only once each year on the Day of Atonement. The chains themselves were works of art, each link formed by master craftsmen who understood that their work would channel the most sacred moments in Israel's religious life. The bronze work outside the temple matched the golden glory within. The 2 great pillars, Jachin and Boaz, rose like bronze trees bearing fruit of hammered metal. Their capitals bloomed with lilywork and pomegranates that symbolized fertility and abundance. These pillars served no structural purpose, yet proclaimed to all who entered that this was a place where heaven touched earth. The great bronze sea dominated the temple courtyard, a circular basin 10 cubits across and 5 cubits deep. 12 bronze oxen supported it, 3 facing each direction of the compass. The sea held water for priestly purification, yet its symbolism reached deeper. It represented the primordial waters of creation, now tamed and sanctified for holy use. 10 smaller bronze lavers on wheeled stands served the daily needs of temple worship. Each laver was a masterpiece of functional art, decorated with lions and oxen and cherubim that seemed ready to spring into motion. The wheels allowed the lavers to be moved as needed, adapting to the rhythm of temple service. The great bronze altar rose like a mountain in the center of the courtyard. Here the daily sacrifices would burn, their smoke carrying prayers heavenward on flames that never died. The altar's horns provided sanctuary for those who grasped them in desperate need. Its dimensions reflected the same sacred mathematics that governed the temple itself. Month followed month as the work progressed with steady certainty. Each season brought new challenges and new victories. Summer heat tested the endurance of workers laboring under bronze and gold. Winter rains required careful protection of partially completed surfaces. Yet the work never stopped, driven by a vision that burned brighter than any earthly discomfort. The 7th year arrived like the fulfillment of ancient promise. 7 days of creation, 7 years of construction. The temple stood complete in its glory, every surface reflecting light that seemed to come from beyond the sun itself. The building breathed with quiet majesty, waiting for the moment when divine presence would transform architecture into sanctuary. Solomon walked through the completed chambers, his heart too full for words. The dream that had haunted his sleep had become reality that exceeded imagination. Cedar and gold, bronze and stone, had combined to create something that belonged as much to heaven as to earth. The temple was finished. Now came the moment that would determine whether it was merely magnificent or truly sacred. The Ark of the Covenant waited in David's tabernacle, ready to make its final journey to the place prepared for it since the foundation of the world. The Ark enters the house. The processional began before dawn broke over Jerusalem. Priests moved through the city like rivers converging toward the sea. Their white linen robes caught the first light as they assembled around David's simple tent where the Ark of the Covenant had waited 30 years for this moment. Every step was choreographed with care that bordered on reverence. The Ark had not moved from its resting place since David brought it dancing into Jerusalem. Now it would make its final journey to the home designed specifically for its glory. The poles that had carried it through wilderness wandering would lift it one last time. The Levites approached the tent with movements that spoke of generations of training. These men had been chosen before birth for this moment. Their fathers and grandfathers had carried the ark through Jordan's waters and around Jericho's walls. Now they would complete the journey that began when Moses first assembled the tabernacle in Sinai's shadow. King Solomon waited at the temple entrance, dressed in robes that rivaled the sunrise. His crown caught early light and threw it back in golden fragments that danced on the temple walls. Behind him stood the assembled nobility of Israel. Every tribe was represented. Every family of significance had sent their finest to witness the day when God would come home. The ark emerged from David's tent like thunder, wrapped in silence. Its golden surface reflected the growing daylight until observers had to shield their eyes. The cherubim that crowned the mercy seat seemed ready to take flight, their wings catching light and shadow in patterns that shifted with each movement of their bearers. The procession moved with stately grace up the slope toward Mount Moriah. Musicians filled the air with melodies that had never been heard before. David himself had composed many of the songs, yet today's celebration required new music for a new chapter in Israel's relationship with their God. Harps and lyres, trumpets and cymbals created a symphony that seemed to lift the ark on wings of sound. Behind the ark came treasures that represented centuries of devotion. The bronze serpent Moses had made in the wilderness, vessels of gold and silver that David had dedicated from his conquests, the altar of incense from the tabernacle, sacred oil and containers carved from olive wood. Everything that had served in the portable sanctuary would find new purpose in the permanent temple. The crowd that lined the processional route defied counting. Jerusalem's population had swollen beyond recognition as pilgrims arrived from every corner of the kingdom and beyond. Representatives from foreign nations watched in wonder as Israel displayed the wealth and wisdom that had made Solomon's name legendary from Egypt to Mesopotamia. Yet this was more than spectacle. Every person present understood they were witnessing the fulfillment of promises made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The wandering was over. The God who had traveled with them through wilderness and conquest was finally coming home to stay. The ark reached the temple courtyard as the sun climbed toward its zenith. Here, the processional paused while priests offered sacrifices that turned the bronze altar into a fountain of flame and smoke. So many oxen and sheep were offered that no one could count them. The smoke rose like a pillar connecting earth to heaven, carrying the prayers of the nation upward on wings of fire. Then came the moment that would echo through eternity. The Levites lifted the ark for its final journey. Step by step, they carried it through the temple entrance, past the bronze pillars that proclaimed God's strength, through the holy place where golden lampstands waited to kindle their eternal flame. The veil that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies parted like a curtain opening on the dawn of time. The ark passed through into the darkness that was brighter than any earthly light. Here, beneath the wings of the golden cherubim, it found its destined resting place. The poles were withdrawn for the final time. The ark would never travel again. Its journeys were complete. The God of Israel had taken up permanent residence among his people, dwelling in the thick darkness of the Holy of Holies, where light was not needed because presence itself provided all illumination. Then it happened. As the priests withdrew from the holy place, cloud began to fill the temple. Not the natural fog of mourning or the smoke of sacrifice, yet something that spoke of divine presence descending like gentle thunder. The cloud grew thicker until the priests could no longer perform their service. They retreated to the courtyard, their faces shining with reflected glory. The temple was no longer empty architecture waiting for purpose. God had moved in with the finality of lightning, choosing its target. The building breathed with presence that transformed every surface from mere decoration to living testimony. Cedar wood and golden overlay had become the dwelling place of the Most High. Solomon fell on his face before the temple, his royal robes spread on stones that had been touched by the feet of angels. His voice carried across the courtyard as he lifted words that came not from prepared speeches, yet from a heart too full to contain its wonder. The Lord has said that he would dwell in thick darkness. I have indeed built you an exalted house, a place for you to dwell in forever. The cloud that filled the temple began to overflow into the courtyard, touching priests and people with the gentle weight of divine approval. Heaven had come to earth. The temple was no longer a building, yet a bridge. The age of glory had truly begun. Solomon's longest prayer. The king stood before the temple as morning light touched its golden surfaces. Around him spread the assembled nation of Israel, their faces turned toward the house where God had chosen to dwell. This was the moment Solomon had prepared for since the first stone was laid, not just the dedication of a building, yet the consecration of a covenant that would bind heaven to earth until time itself grew old. Solomon's voice carried across the courtyard with the authority of one who had spoken with God in dreams. His words began not with royal proclamation, yet with humble acknowledgement of divine mystery. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? The prayer that followed revealed depths of wisdom that went beyond human learning. Solomon had pondered the meaning of the temple through 7 years of construction. Now his understanding poured forth like water from a spring that had been sealed until this moment of completion. Yet have regard to the prayer of your servant and to his plea, O Lord my God, listening to the cry and to the prayer that your servant prays before you this day, that your eyes may be open night and day toward this house, the place of which you have said, My name shall be there. that you may listen to the prayer that your servant offers toward this place." The king's words painted pictures of future that stretched across centuries. He saw Israel in prosperity and Israel in defeat. He saw the temple filled with worshippers and the temple standing empty. His prayer was not celebration, yet prophecy, acknowledging both the glory of the present moment and the struggles that lay ahead. When your people Israel are defeated before the enemy because they have sinned against you, and if they turn again to you and acknowledge your name and pray and plead with you in this house, then hear in heaven and forgive the sin of your people Israel and bring them again to the land that you gave to their fathers. Solomon's prayer acknowledged the harsh reality of human nature. The people would not remain faithful. They would chase after other gods and break the covenant that bound them to the Lord. Yet even in their rebellion, the temple would stand as a beacon calling them home. When they returned with broken hearts and empty hands, God would hear their cries and restore what had been lost. The king spoke of drought and famine, of plague and blight that would test the nation's faith. He saw locusts darkening the sky and foreign armies camping outside Jerusalem's walls. Yet for every disaster, he offered the same solution. Turn toward the temple. Pray toward the house where God's name dwells. Find forgiveness in the place where sacrifice meets mercy. His words reached beyond Israel to embrace the nations that watched from distant lands. Likewise, when a foreigner who is not of your people Israel comes from a far country for your name's sake, for they shall hear of your great name and your mighty hand, and of your outstretched arm. When he comes and prays toward this house, hear in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you. The vision was breathtaking in its scope. The temple would draw seekers from every corner of the earth. Phoenicians and Egyptians, Babylonians and Cushites would journey to Jerusalem to encounter the God of Israel. The house built for one nation would become a lighthouse for all peoples, searching for divine truth. Solomon's prayer climaxed with words that seemed to come from beyond his own understanding. He spoke of exile and return, of scattering and regathering, of judgment and restoration. The temple would witness Israel's greatest triumphs and deepest defeats. Yet through it all, God's faithfulness would endure like the stones that formed its foundation. Yet if they lay it to heart in the land to which they have been carried captive, and repent and plead with you in the land of their captors, saying, "We have sinned and have acted perversely and wickedly," if they repent with all their mind and with all their heart in the land of their enemies, who carried them captive, and pray to you toward their land which you gave to their fathers, the city that you have chosen, and the house that I have built for your name, then hear in heaven your dwelling place, their prayer and their plea. The words hung in the air like incense ascending to heaven. Solomon had spoken not just as king, yet as prophet, seeing through time to witness the entire span of his people's relationship with God. The temple dedication had become a rehearsal for dramas that would unfold across centuries of human history. When the prayer ended, fire fell from heaven and consumed the sacrifices on the bronze altar. The people fell on their faces as divine approval blazed before their eyes. God had heard every word and sealed them with flame that spoke louder than thunder. For 7 days, the celebration continued. The temple courts overflowed with worshippers who came to witness the glory that had descended on Mount Moriah. The dedication became a festival that transformed Jerusalem into the center of the ancient world. Representatives from every nation carried reports home of the wisdom of Solomon and the magnificence of Israel's God. Yet perhaps the most profound moment came in the quiet hours after the crowds dispersed. Solomon stood alone in the temple courtyard, looking up at the building that had consumed 7 years of his life. The prayer he had offered was more than dedication, it was surrender. He had acknowledged that the temple belonged not to him, yet to the God who had chosen to dwell within its walls. The golden house stood silent in the moonlight, its surfaces reflecting stars that seemed close enough to touch. Inside, the Ark of the Covenant rested in darkness that pulsed with presence. The temple was no longer empty architecture, yet living sanctuary where heaven and earth met in perfect harmony. Solomon's prayer had accomplished something beyond the dedication of a building. It had established the spiritual constitution that would govern Israel's relationship with God for generations to come. The temple was not just a place, yet a promise. Not just a building, yet a bridge. The dwelling place of God had opened its doors to all who would seek the Lord with sincere hearts. The temple system. Dawn brought the first stirring of activity to the temple courts. Priests moved through the darkness like shepherds tending flocks that never slept. The fire on the bronze altar had burned through the night, its flames reaching towards stars that faded as morning light touched the eastern horizon. The daily sacrifice began before the first worshipper arrived. A lamb without blemish was examined by experienced eyes that could detect the smallest flaw. The animal had to be perfect, reflecting the holiness of the God to whom it would be offered. Every spot, every mark disqualified it from service on the altar, where only perfection was acceptable. The priest who performed the morning sacrifice had prepared through ritual washing that symbolized inner purification. His white linen garments gleamed in the lamplight, marking him as one set apart for sacred service. The cutting of the lamb's throat was swift and merciful, its blood caught in golden bowls that reflected the flames dancing on the altar. Blood marked the boundaries between life and death, between holy and common, between forgiven and condemned. The priests sprinkled it on the altar's horns, while the fire consumed flesh that would never feed human hunger. The smoke that rose carried more than the scent of burning meat. It carried prayers and hopes, confessions and thanksgivings from hearts that understood their need for divine mercy. Inside the holy place, other priests tended the golden lampstands that burned with oil pressed from olives grown in sacred groves. 7 flames danced in perfect symmetry, casting light on walls that gleamed like captured sunlight. The lamps never went out, symbolizing the eternal nature of God's covenant with Israel. The table of bread held 12 loaves, one for each tribe of Israel. Fresh bread replaced the old each Sabbath in a ceremony that connected harvest to hope. The priests who removed the bread would eat it in the holy place, transforming common grain into communion with the divine. Nothing in the temple lacked meaning. Every action spoke of relationship between God and his chosen people. The altar of incense sent smoke toward heaven through windows that opened to the sky. Frankincense and myrrh, cinnamon and cassia, blended in proportions that had been revealed to Moses on Mount Sinai. The fragrance spoke of prayers rising like smoke, of worship ascending like flames that reached beyond the physical realm into the presence of God himself. The high priest moved through these rituals with reverence that bordered on terror. Once each year on the Day of Atonement, he would pass beyond the veil into the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant waited in darkness that blazed brighter than any earthly light. Even his preparation for that moment required days of purification and prayer. The bronze sea in the courtyard provided water for the constant washing that temple service required. Priests cleansed their hands and feet before approaching any sacred object. The 10 smaller lavers served similar purposes, their wheeled stands, allowing them to be moved as needed throughout the temple complex. Purity was not optional, yet essential for anyone who would serve in God's house. Ordinary Israelites brought their offerings through gates that opened onto scenes of carefully organized activity. Lambs and doves, grain and oil, wine and incense flowed through the temple system like lifeblood through veins. Each offering represented relationship between the giver and God, mediated by priests who understood the sacred mathematics of sacrifice and forgiveness. The festivals transformed the temple into the beating heart of national identity. Passover brought pilgrims from every corner of the kingdom to remember the night when death passed over houses marked with lamb's blood. The Feast of Weeks celebrated the first fruits of harvest and the giving of the law on Mount Sinai. The Feast of Tabernacles recalled wilderness wandering while celebrating present abundance. During these festivals, the temple courts overflowed with celebrants whose joy echoed off stone walls and golden surfaces. Musicians played instruments crafted specifically for temple worship. Singers lifted voices trained from childhood to carry melodies that seemed to bridge earth and heaven. The sound of worship rose like incense, filling the air with praise that could be heard throughout Jerusalem. The temple treasury accumulated wealth that exceeded the resources of most kingdoms. Gold and silver flowed in from conquered territories and trading partnerships. Precious stones found their way into temple vessels that gleamed like captured stars. The wealth served not royal luxury, yet divine worship, transformed from earthly treasure into offerings that honored the King of all creation. Yet the temple's true treasure was not gold or silver, yet the presence that filled its innermost chamber. The cloud that had descended during the dedication never fully departed. Priests serving in the holy place sometimes glimpsed movements in their peripheral vision, as if beings invisible to human eyes moved through the sacred spaces on missions beyond mortal understanding. The system that governed temple worship reflected divine order imposed on human chaos. Every priest knew his role, every sacrifice followed prescribed patterns, every festival occurred at appointed times. The temple breathed with rhythms that connected daily life to eternal purpose, transforming routine into worship and worship into relationship with the living God. As evening approached, the final sacrifice of the day sent smoke rising toward stars that appeared like pinholes in heaven's veil. The temple settled into the quiet rhythms of night watch, its fires burning steadily while Jerusalem slept. The house that Solomon built had become more than architecture. The temple stood as the pivotal center of Israel's universe, from the dwelling place of the divine to the seat of royal authority. More than just divine radiance gleamed off those golden walls. They reflected back the political mastery of a ruler who grasped that spiritual command and earthly dominance merged together, flowing as streams that feed into one mighty river. What Solomon constructed went beyond simply a dwelling for the Almighty. He erected the foundational stone of an empire destined to transform the ancient world as they knew it. The palace structures rising next to the temple communicated their own narrative of deliberate grandeur. The house of the forest of Lebanon extended even farther than the temple's length. Cedar pillars formed forests of opulence that declared wealth surpassing all imagination. Within these halls, ambassadors from distant lands would wait, spaces engineered to flood their senses and diminish their assumptions. Solomon's personal residence required 13 years for completion, approaching double the time needed for constructing the temple. Observant guests did not miss this symbolism. Where God's dwelling had ascended with celestial speed, the monarch's home expanded with mortal patience. Each chamber announced the magnificence of the sovereign who accomplished what no previous Israelite king had ventured to pursue. The Hall of Pillars functioned as the throne chamber, where Solomon presided under a covering that appeared to capture the heavens themselves. Carved from ivory and covered with the purest gold, the throne featured 6 ascending steps, positioning the king in a space between the earthly realm and the celestial. Lions stood guard at every step, 12 protectors total, proclaiming the sovereign's dominion over all, approaching to seek judgment or request favor. The porch of judgment housed the throne of justice, where Solomon delivered verdicts that achieved legendary status across the civilized world. In this place, the king's celebrated wisdom took practical form, through decisions that exposed truth concealed under multiple layers of human falsehood. People traveled from far-off territories simply to observe the brilliance that could solve puzzles other monarchs could not even comprehend. Yet the most telling structure was the residence Solomon constructed for Pharaoh's daughter, his principal queen. The Egyptian princess inhabited quarters comparable to her father's palace, surrounded by splendor that announced her husband's standing as a peer to the ancient royal families of the Nile. The marriage itself represented a diplomatic triumph, securing peace with Egypt while showcasing Israel's rise as a regional force. The queen's residence stood intentionally separated from Solomon's other wives' living areas, signifying both political requirement and personal devotion. The king's union with Pharaoh's daughter had outraged traditional Israelites who recalled the law's cautions regarding foreign wives. Yet Solomon perceived beyond religious resistance to political advantage. Egypt's alliance held more value than gold itself, and his wife's residence in Jerusalem confirmed a partnership that safeguarded Israel's southern frontier. Commerce paths that had bypassed Israel for generations now directed toward Jerusalem like wheel spokes, meeting at a hub. Solomon's command of the intersection between Africa and Asia, between Egypt and Mesopotamia, loaded the royal coffers with silver until it grew as plentiful as roadside stones. Traders who previously journeyed through Phoenician harbors now discovered it advantageous to negotiate directly with the monarch, controlling the land passage, linking 3 continents. The celebrated arrival of the Queen of Sheba showed how extensively Solomon's fame had spread. The Arabian sovereign came not as a petitioner but as an equal, examining the wisdom she had heard, praised in every marketplace from Damascus to Memphis. Her procession delivered spices and gold, gemstones and rare timber, gifts appropriate for a king who had reached legendary standing during his own lifetime. Solomon's naval fleet departed from Ezion-Geber on expeditions that returned with riches from territories whose names were spoken like enchanted words. Vessels came back from 3-year voyages, transporting gold from Ophir, silver from Tarshish, ivory and apes and peacocks from regions that lay at the edge of the known world. The king's trading ships made him the wealthiest sovereign of his era, converting Israel from scattered shepherd tribes into a commercial powerhouse. The temple supplied divine endorsement for this extraordinary concentration of authority and riches. When foreign monarchs visited Jerusalem, they witnessed first the house of God, ascending on Mount Moriah like a golden mountain, its splendor declaring that Israel's king governed with heavenly sanction. The nearness of palace to temple was not coincidental, but fundamental to Solomon's political approach. Religious celebrations transformed into occasions for diplomatic exhibition as much as spiritual observance. Foreign envoys watched the complex ceremonies surrounding temple worship, observing rituals that proclaimed Israel's distinct connection with the divine. The gold covering every surface, pause. The exact choreography of priestly duties, pause. The incense cloud rising like visible prayers, pause. All merged to generate impressions, serving political alongside religious functions. Solomon's governing structure partitioned the kingdom into 12 districts, cutting through customary tribal territories. Each district bore responsibility for provisioning the royal household 1 month annually, a requirement demanding the complete output of whole regions. The arrangement proved effective but burdensome, requiring resources that strained even Israel's exceptional prosperity. The king's daily needs revealed the magnitude of royal extravagance. 30 measures of fine flour, pause. 60 measures of meal, pause. 10 fattened oxen, pause. 20 pasture-fed cattle, pause. 100 sheep, pause. Plus deer and gazelles and roebucks and fattened fowl, pause. For the tables feeding not merely the royal family, but hundreds of administrators and attendants who kept the government operating. Still, this exhibition of wealth and authority fulfilled purposes extending beyond royal luxury. Every foreign guest witnessing Solomon's magnificence returned home carrying accounts of Israel's greatness. The temple and palace together functioned to project an impression of divine blessing that defended the kingdom more successfully than any military force. Adversaries thought twice before attacking a nation whose God resided among them in such evident grandeur. The transformation was thorough. The nomadic tribes that had seized Canaan under Joshua had evolved into an established empire, commanding admiration from Egypt to Assyria. The temple sheltering God's presence also secured a political framework that would shape the ancient world for generations ahead. Solomon had accomplished something without precedent in human chronicles. the flawless merging of religious dedication and political drive. Fractures in the gold. The golden era shimmers, then vanishes like morning moisture on Jerusalem's stone surfaces. Solomon occupies his ivory throne, encircled by riches that overwhelm comprehension. 700 wives from far-off territories fill his palace chambers, their speech forming a chorus of foreign languages. Each union secures another agreement, opens another trade passage, directs another flow of tribute, pouring into Jerusalem's treasuries like waterways joining at the ocean. The temple continues gleaming on Mount Moriah, its gold capturing dawn's initial light, its cedar timbers releasing the sweet aroma of Lebanon's woodlands. Priests maintain their timeless patterns. Morning offerings pause. Evening incense pause. The perpetual rhythm of worship connecting heaven to earth. Still, something changes in the king's spirit, subtle as lengthening shadows at sunset. The youth who once encountered God in Gibeon's high place now encounters earthly satisfaction. The young sovereign who requested wisdom above all possessions now requests more, constantly more. Additional gold from Ophir's mines, greater dominion over surrounding realms, increased pleasure from an ever-expanding harem extending across 3 continents. Foreign princesses arrive, bringing more than dowries. They introduce household deities carved from valuable stones, clergy versed in secrets older than Abraham's covenant, incense that burns for gods, whose names were ancient when Egypt was young. Solomon, pause, the most learned man who ever existed, pause, discovers himself listening to their murmured prayers, pause, observing their midnight ceremonies, pause, gradually bending his knee before altars not erected for Israel's God. The Egyptian princess introduces representations of Ra and Isis. The Moabite wives sing lullabies to Chemosh while nursing royal offspring. Sidonian women burn incense to Ashtoreth in rooms overlooking the very temple where Solomon once received God's voice. The irony penetrates more deeply than any blade. The constructor of God's dwelling now erects shrines for rival deities on the hills encircling Jerusalem. High places emerge like mushrooms following rainfall. Cedar and stone that should honor the covenant instead accommodate foreign worship. The king who once brought Israel together under one God now scatters the nation's devotion among many. Each shrine signifies another fracture in the foundation of faith. Pause, another movement away from the divine purpose that formed his youth. The weight of Solomon's construction ventures settles on Israel's back like an iron burden. Forced labor crews work the stone quarries from sunrise to sunset, their mallets striking against rock in cadences, speaking of exhaustion rather than worship. Taxes drain the northern tribes, flowing southward to finance building endeavors that appear to multiply like desert grains. Cedar arrives from Hiram of Tyre, but at costs that deplete the royal coffers. Gold comes from distant Ophir, but the vessels return less regularly now. Pause, their cargo holds carrying more exotic indulgences than useful wealth. The economy that once flourished now buckles under the burden of royal excess. Northern tribal chieftains assemble in their hereditary lands, speaking in quiet voices of burdens their ancestors never carried. The cohesion that David forged through bloodshed and kinship starts to fracture like sun-dried clay. Ancient separations buried beneath decades of prosperity awaken once more. Prophets traverse Jerusalem's pathways with troubled expressions, their vision perceiving what others cannot or refuse to recognize. They observe wealth corrupting wisdom. Notice power generating pride. See faith splintering into 1,000 conflicting allegiances. Their cautions land on ears deafened by the perpetual sound of gold pieces. Their declarations drowned by the noise of foreign percussion, beating rhythms for alien deities. Nathan, the prophet, who once challenged David with a simple tale about a stolen lamb, ages while watching Solomon's spiritual deterioration. The divine presence that once saturated the temple during its consecration appears to recede like ocean tide from the beach. God's voice, once crisp as mountain streams, diminishes to whisper, pause, then to quietness. In Damascus, a young prince named Rezon assembles dissidents and insurgents. His animosity towards Solomon blazes bright as furnace fire, fueled by remembrances of lands lost to Israel's expansion, pause of tribute rendered under pressure, pause of sovereignty exchanged for survival. He develops his power methodically, awaiting the instant when Solomon's control falters. In Edom, Prince Hadad returns from Egyptian refuge, his spirit harboring decades of bitterness like burning embers. The child who once escaped Solomon's conquest now returns as a grown man, supported by Pharaoh's wealth and equipped with fierce resolve. The empire that appeared so stable, so enduring, exposes its weaknesses like a cracked base under strain. Solomon's spirit grows distant toward the covenant that shaped his youth, the commitments that lifted his father from shepherd child to monarch. The temple becomes less a dwelling of prayer, more an emblem of royal power. Its sacred objects shine with polish, but their holy function fades like oil lamps depleting their fuel. Ceremony persists, but connection withers. Deep in the night within his chamber overlooking the Temple Mount, Solomon writes by wavering candlelight. His phrases speak of emptiness, of pursuing wind across barren wastelands, of the void that gold cannot satisfy and authority cannot fulfill. The man who possessed everything the world could provide discovers he grasps nothing that genuinely counts. Ecclesiastes pours from his pen, like weeping. Each line a confession of spiritual desolation disguised as philosophical meditation. The golden exterior develops hairline cracks, spreading with each passing season. Palace conspiracies increase as foreign wives battle for their children's succession claims. Court councillors separate into camps, some backing this prince, others championing that princess. The wisdom for which Solomon gained renown becomes obscured by contradictory counsel from excessive sources. What commenced as divine favor gradually converts into human affliction. The temple persists, its walls remaining solid, its gold still radiant, but its builder's faith disintegrates like ancient manuscript exposed to desert gales. The fractures in Solomon's nature become fractures in the kingdom's base, extending outward through the nation like splits in broken stone. A realm divided into halves. Solomon passes away as autumn foliage falls in Jerusalem, and the kingdom trembles like a tree before winter tempests. His 40-year reign concludes not in the splendor of his golden zenith, but in the darkness of compromise and spiritual deterioration. The man who erected the temple for God's magnificence draws his last breath, surrounded by foreign gods and abandoned covenants. His son, Rehoboam, inherits beyond a crown. He receives a kingdom straining at its boundaries. Northern tribes suffering under decades of oppressive taxation. A population whose cohesion exists more in recollection than actuality. The young monarch confronts his initial challenge before the royal mark has dried on Solomon's sepulchre. The northern tribes dispatch word to Shechem, the historic meeting place where Abraham first received God's commitment, where Jacob came back from his banishment, where Joshua restored the covenant after subduing Canaan. Their communication is straightforward yet loaded with generations of resentment. Come northward, Rehoboam, accept our loyalty, but initially listen to our conditions. Rehoboam journeys north with all the ceremony his father instructed him to cherish. Golden chariots proceed through dust storms, raised by 1,000 steeds. Attendants in silk and purple trail their young monarch like peacocks following their chief. The spectacle intends to impress, but it accomplishes the reverse. Every golden decoration reminds the northern tribes of the levies that financed such extravagance. At Shechem, beneath the oak trees that have observed centuries of covenant forming, the tribal elders wait with composed faces and hardened spirits. Jeroboam stands with them, recently returned from Egyptian exile, where he fled Solomon's anger years before. His attendance adds significance to the northern cause, authenticity to their complaints. Their representative advances with words measured as precisely as a priest portions incense. The communication is plain. Your father imposed on us a heavy yoke through forced labor and devastating taxes. Reduce the burdens he placed upon us. Diminish the severity of his requirements, and we will serve you as devotedly as we served David, your grandfather. The instant hangs, suspended like morning vapor over the Jordan Valley. History turns on Rehoboam's answer. A prudent response could mend the widening breach. A kind word could maintain the united kingdom David established with his blood and Solomon enlarged with his wisdom. Rehoboam requests 3 days to contemplate their petition, 3 days that extend like years, 3 days that will transform the ancient world, 3 days during which the destiny of God's chosen population hangs in uncertainty. The young monarch seeks advice, but the voices he hears present conflicting wisdom. The elderly counselors, grey-bearded men who assisted Solomon in his early, more sensible years, speak with the deliberate tones of experience. Their guidance carries the authority of decades. Listen to the people's plea, they press. Serve them well, ease their burden, and they will remain with you forever. A king's genuine power resides not in the severity of his yoke, but in the devotion of his subjects. However, younger voices murmur different advice in Rehoboam's hearing. The king's childhood associates, raised in palace extravagance, understanding comfort but not hardship, abundance but not deprivation. They have never felt a laborer's calloused palms or heard a farmer's complaint over excessive levies. Their counsel springs from arrogance rather than wisdom. Demonstrate your power, they press. Amplify rather than reduce the royal requirements. Let them understand who governs in Israel. These young advisors employ the language Rehoboam comprehends best. Pause. The language of authority without accountability, power without service. Their phrases appeal to his inexperience and his pride equally. Why should a monarch yield to his subjects' petitions? Why should royal authority accommodate common grievances? The 3 days elapse like water through cupped palms. When Rehoboam returns to the gathering at Shechem, his choice is inscribed in the severity of his countenance, the rigidity of his stance, the conceit of his royal demeanor. His response descends like hammer strikes on the waiting assembly. My father imposed on you a heavy yoke, but I will make it heavier still. He disciplined you with whips, but I will discipline you with scorpions. If you considered Solomon's reign burdensome, pause. Wait until you encounter mine. The phrases reverberate off the ancient stones of Shechem, like thunder rolling through mountain passages. For an instant, astonished silence grips the assembly. Then the northern tribes erupt like a volcano that has restrained its pressure too long. Historic war cries resound across the hills, words not uttered since the turbulent era of the judges. What share have we in David? What legacy do we possess in Jesse's son? To your tents, O Israel. Look after your own household, David. The United Kingdom fractures along fault lines that were perpetually present but never completely healed. 10 tribes separate in a single morning, their choice as rapid as it is permanent. They crown Jeroboam as their monarch on the identical location where Rehoboam anticipated receiving their tribute. Only Judah and small Benjamin stay faithful to David's household, a kingdom diminished to a portion of its previous magnitude. The empire that extended from the Euphrates to Egypt's frontiers now commands little beyond the hills surrounding Jerusalem and the land south to Beersheba. The temple continues standing on Mount Moriah in all its golden magnificence, but its influence extends over a reduced domain. The unified kingdom that David constructed through warfare, that Solomon broadened through wisdom, divides like a great tree struck by celestial lightning. Jeroboam confronts an immediate predicament, threatening his new kingdom's very survival. His population has worshipped in Jerusalem for generations. The temple draws them southward for every celebration, every principal offering, every important religious ceremony. Each pilgrimage reinforces their connections to Judah while diminishing their loyalty to the northern kingdom. The new monarch's answer cuts profoundly into the core of Israel's faith. Golden calves ascend at Bethel in the south and Dan in the north. Historic, holy locations from the days before the temple, centralized worship. "Behold your gods, O Israel," Jeroboam announces with phrases that mirror the darkest instant in their wilderness wandering, which delivered you up from the territory of Egypt. The calves are not intended as competing gods, but as platforms for the invisible God, foundations from which the Almighty might govern his population. Yet the symbolism proves too risky, the similarity to pagan worship too powerful. What commences as political requirement becomes spiritual compromise, then descends toward complete apostasy. Two kingdoms now assert descent from Jacob. Two royal families trace their ancestry to David's covenant. Two populations claim the privilege to identify themselves as Israel, but only one retains the temple, the ark, the priesthood, the dwelling constructed for God's name. The separation transforms everything that once appeared lasting. Kinsmen become adversaries across an artificial boundary. Common history becomes disputed recollection. Shared legacy becomes rival assertions. Commerce routes that once enriched the United Kingdom now become obstacles between competing nations. The temple, once the emblem of unity drawing all 12 tribes to shared worship, now designates the border between rival kingdoms. Its very presence becomes a political threat to the north, a reminder of what they have forfeited, a magnet threatening to pull their affections back to their historic center. Idle conflicts and sacred transformations. Generations elapse like clouds across Jerusalem's sky, each delivering new monarchs, new trials, new examinations of faith. The temple stands unchanging, while kingdoms surrounding it ascend and descend like wheat before the harvest wind. Some sovereigns walk in David's footsteps, following the historic paths of righteousness. Others pursue foreign gods with the zeal their forefather Abraham once reserved for the one true God. The temple becomes beyond a structure. It converts into a battleground for Judah's soul. Pause, a measurement of the nation's spiritual condition. Pause, a reflection displaying each generation's connection with their covenant God. Its stones observe both the pinnacles of religious commitment and the valleys of spiritual apostasy. King Ahaz governs in Jerusalem when the massive Assyrian war apparatus rolls westward like an iron flood. The northern kingdom of Israel stands precisely in its trajectory, and Ahaz observes with mounting dread as city after city succumbs to winged bulls and bearded monarchs portrayed in Assyrian artwork. Samaria itself wavers on the brink of annihilation, its population confronting deportation to far-off territories. Terror seizes Ahaz's spirit with icy talons. The identical destiny befalling Israel might readily overtake Judah. His modest kingdom possesses neither Israel's population nor its martial power. When Assyrian emissaries arrive requiring tribute, the young monarch confronts an impossible selection: oppose and face destruction, or surrender and become a vassal. In desperation, Ahaz strips gold from the temple entrances, the very gates through which worshippers pass into God's dwelling. He removes silver fixtures from the sanctuary surfaces, liquefies sacred containers that once contained offerings, and transmits it all as tribute to Tiglath-Pileser. Pause, the Assyrian emperor, whose name inspires terror across the ancient world. Yet tribute wealth alone cannot appease Ahaz's alarm or ensure his continuation. Political submission demands religious recognition in the ancient world. When the Assyrian monarch summons Ahaz to Damascus to accept his vassal's pledge, the Judean ruler witnesses beyond his expectations. In Damascus stands an altar, dissimilar to anything in Jerusalem. A colossal structure consecrated to Assyrian deities, decorated with emblems of divine authority before which conquered peoples bow. The altar signifies beyond religious construction. It embodies the spiritual power supporting Assyrian political supremacy. Ahaz examines the altar with the vision of a desperate man pursuing any benefit. He calculates its proportions, commits to memory its ornamentation, diagrams its pattern on parchment that he protects like military intelligence. When he comes back to Jerusalem, his initial directive sends tremors through the temple establishment. Construct an exact duplicate, he commands Uriah the priest. Build this altar in our temple courtyard and establish it as the focal point of our worship. The priest wavers. Such a directive violates everything the temple represents, but royal power overcomes religious principles. The new altar ascends beside the historic bronze altar that David erected, the altar where Abraham nearly sacrificed Isaac, where innumerable generations presented their offerings to the God of their ancestors. Now, foreign gods occupy space with the Almighty. Pagan emblems stand where only the name of the Lord should be revered. Ahaz's son Hezekiah inherits a defiled sanctuary when he assumes the throne. At 25, the young sovereign surveys the temple complex with vision that perceives not splendid architecture but spiritual ruin. Foreign altars crowd the sacred courtyards. Pagan clergy conduct alien ceremonies. The bronze altar of burnt offering sits forsaken like a rejected artifact. Hezekiah's initial royal action sends tremors through Jerusalem. He commands the temple purified from base to summit. Laborers stream into the sanctuary complex, removing armloads of foreign idols, destroying images that have stood for years, demolishing altars that his father constructed with such attention. The massive bronze serpent that Moses fashioned in the wilderness, maintained for 7 centuries as a memorial of God's healing authority, meets the hammer alongside Assyrian deities. It had transformed into an object of adoration rather than remembrance, accepting incense that belonged to God exclusively. The temple entrances, sealed during Ahaz's reign, like vision closed against disgraceful sights, open again with sounds that resonate through vacant courtyards. Priests emerge, blinking in sudden illumination, many having ministered in darkness for years, their legitimate duties diminished to maintaining foreign altars. Purification requires beyond physical elimination of corrupting influences. Hezekiah commands the temple rededicated, following historic ritual. The bronze altar is returned to its legitimate position and purpose. Sacred containers that were stored during the dark years come back to their intended use. Yet Hezekiah's transformations extend beyond simple restoration. The young monarch dispatches messengers northward to the dispersed survivors of Israel, survivors of Assyrian deportation still maintaining their ancestral faith. Come southward for Passover, the invitation presses. Come, celebrate in Jerusalem, as your ancestors did in David's era. The response surpasses anticipation. From Ephraim and Manasseh, from Zebulun and Naphtali, from every region of what was once the northern kingdom, survivors make pilgrimage to Jerusalem. The temple courts resound with voices that have not been heard united since Solomon's golden age. For 14 days they celebrate, prolonging the festival beyond its designated week, because delight cannot be restrained in ordinary limitations. The temple sacrifice arrangement operates at full capacity, priests laboring in rotations to manage the quantity of offerings presented by this unexpected multitude. Still, even Hezekiah's virtuous legacy proves delicate. His son Manasseh inherits the throne at 12 years old, and 55 years of his governance reverse his father's transformations like floodwaters, erasing careful plantings. Altars to foreign deities appear in the temple courts like weeds following spring downpours. Baal and Asherah, Molech, and the Queen of Heaven. Every deity that Hezekiah expelled returns with reinforcements. Sacred prostitution, that abomination converting worship into transaction and holiness into desire, establishes itself in the very rooms where priests once resided in purity. The supreme blasphemy arrives when Manasseh positions an image of Asherah, Pause, the fertility goddess, Pause, in the Holy of Holies itself. the most sacred location in the world, where only the high priest may enter and only once annually, becomes a shrine to pagan sexuality. Child sacrifice returns to Judah under Manasseh's governance. In the valley of Hinnom, immediately outside Jerusalem's ramparts, the flames of Molech ignite again. Parents driven by desperation or misled by false commitments offer their own children to fires that promise wealth but deliver only ashes. For more than half a century, this corruption festers. An entire generation matures witnessing pagan worship as customary, temple prostitution as tolerable, child sacrifice as an regrettable but occasionally essential aspect of religious existence. The recollection of genuine worship dims like oil lamps, exhausting their fuel. Manasseh's grandson Josiah inherits this spiritual wasteland when he becomes monarch at 8 years old. For the initial 18 years of his governance, the young sovereign administers a people that has forgotten its own character, a population whose covenant understanding exists more in concealed scrolls than living exercise. The instant of disclosure arrives during temple repairs in Josiah's 18th year. Laborers clearing debris from forgotten rooms discover something extraordinary. Pause. An ancient scroll concealed during some previous crisis and forgotten by generations of clergy. Hilkiah, the high priest, brings the scroll to the monarch with shaking hands. As the ancient phrases are recited aloud, perhaps the book of Deuteronomy itself, perhaps a wider collection of Moses' instructions, Josiah's response is immediate and visceral. He rips his royal garments in distress, his spirit broken by the distance between what God demands and what his kingdom practices. The scroll contains laws his population has forgotten, blessings they have surrendered, curses that now suspend over them like storm clouds prepared to release. Every page indicts the present generation. Every commandment emphasizes their failure. Every commitment reveals their spiritual destitution. Yet the ancient phrases also present hope. Repentance can still prevent catastrophe. Transformation can still restore connection. It may be late, but it is not yet too late. Josiah's transformation exceeds even Hezekiah's purification in its comprehensiveness and extent. Pagan altars do not merely come down, they are pulverized to powder and dispersed like dust. Foreign clergy do not merely forfeit their stations, they are expelled from the kingdom completely. The high places that mark the landscape since Solomon's era, the regional shrines that even virtuous kings permitted, finally meet their annihilation. From Dan to Beersheba, every unauthorized altar descends. Every rival worship location is demolished. The cleansing extends beyond Judah's boundaries. Josiah marches northward into what was once Israel's land, now thinly populated Assyrian territories. At Bethel, he annihilates the altar Jeroboam erected 3 centuries before, crushing its stones to powder, burning the Asherah that stood alongside it. For one brief, radiant instant, the temple stands as pure as the day. Solomon consecrated it to God's magnificence. The historic patterns of worship resume their legitimate cadences. Priests operate according to Moses' directives. The population rediscovers celebrations they had forgotten, observances their grandparents had relinquished. Yet even as Josiah celebrates his successful transformations, prophetic voices murmur cautions in the Jerusalem pathways. Jeremiah, young and sincere, speaks phrases that chill righteous spirits. The transformation has arrived too late, excessive damage has been inflicted, too many years of decay have elapsed. Too many generations have matured without knowing their God. The purification is genuine but incomplete. It eliminates external manifestations but cannot remedy internal spiritual sickness. It restores appropriate worship but cannot regenerate authentic faith. The temple shines with restored holiness. Yet the spirits of the population remain mostly unchanged. Josiah perishes fighting Pharaoh Necho at Megiddo, and with him perishes the final prospect of sustained spiritual restoration. The monarchs who succeed him rapidly relinquish his transformations. The temple returns to its pattern of decay and compromise. The fractures that Josiah temporarily mended expand once again, preparing the path for the final disaster that approaches like a tempest on the horizon. The Babylonian tempest. Dark storm clouds accumulate on the eastern skyline like messengers of judgment. The massive Assyrian Empire, which once appeared as lasting as the mountains themselves, disintegrates beneath the unified attack of Babylon and Media. Nineveh collapses with a crash that reverberates across the ancient world. Its magnificent ramparts reduced to rubble, its winged bulls cast into the dust. From the ruins of Assyrian supremacy emerges a new authority, more fearsome than the previous. Nebuchadnezzar II claims the throne of Babylon, with ambitions extending from the Euphrates to the Mediterranean, from the peaks of Armenia to the Arabian deserts. His military forces advance like locusts, devouring everything in their trajectory, abandoning devastation where once stood prosperous kingdoms. In Jerusalem, King Jehoiakim observes these developments with the shrewd vision of a survivor. The modest kingdom of Judah occupies the junction of empires. Too feeble to withstand the great authorities, too strategic to be disregarded, every choice becomes a wager with national continuation as the stakes. Jehoiakim selects to engage in a perilous game of diplomatic maneuvering. He renders tribute to Babylon while covertly cultivating Egyptian backing, dispatches representatives eastward while hosting Egyptian counselors, declares allegiance to Nebuchadnezzar while conspiring with Pharaoh Necho. The temple coffers, once brimming with Solomon's amassed riches, now depletes continuously to finance this precarious balancing performance. Sacred containers that once served exclusively for worship transform into currency in desperate diplomatic exchanges. Gold that was devoted to God's magnificence flows eastward as tribute to pagan monarchs. Silver fixtures vanish from the temple surfaces, liquefied to purchase time and temporary protection. The prophet Jeremiah traverses the temple courtyards with tears flowing down his weathered countenance like rain on historic stones. His communication penetrates through the comfortable illusions, sustaining false optimism. This dwelling you trust in will become like Shiloh, forsaken and forgotten. The holy location itself will collapse unless Judah turns from its corrupt practices with authentic repentance. The population's response to such prophecies blazes with righteous fury. How dare this son of a priest from Anathoth speak against the temple of the living God? This is the dwelling the Almighty selected for his name, the sanctuary he committed to establish permanently. Certainly the God who rescued Jerusalem from Sennacherib's siege will never permit foreign armies to defile his dwelling. Their faith rests on foundations of sand, political estimations disguised as theological certainty, nationalist arrogance masquerading as religious commitment. They cite God's commitments while disregarding God's stipulations, assert covenant blessings while transgressing covenant responsibilities. Jeremiah persists despite their fury, his voice intensifying as resistance escalates. He speaks of 70 years in banishment, of the temple reduced to smoldering remains, of sacred containers transported away as plunder to adorn pagan shrines. He prophesies judgment so thorough that future generations will inquire in astonishment what great transgression brought such disaster upon God's chosen population. The assembly desires to stone him for such apparent sacrilege. How can God's representative prophesy against God's dwelling? How can one asserting to speak for the Almighty predict the annihilation of the Almighty's residence? Their reasoning seems irrefutable. Their faith appears unshakable, but both rest on assumptions that disregard the moral foundations of divine covenant. Yet, Jeremiah's phrases prove prophetic rather than sacrilegious. Young King Jehoiachin inherits his father's rebellion alongside his crown, and Babylon responds with swift effectiveness that constructed their empire. The siege apparatus that demolished Assyria's powerful fortifications rolls across the hills of Judah like iron thunder, their approach heralded by refugees escaping before them. Jerusalem's ramparts, reinforced by Hezekiah and sustained by subsequent monarchs, tremble under the attack of Babylonian engineering. Battering rams pound the gates, while catapults hurl stones the magnitude of sheep against the fortifications. The city that appeared impenetrable discovers the boundaries of human fortification when confronted by divine judgment. The initial deportation commences with surgical exactness. Nebuchadnezzar does not desire to annihilate Judah's productive capability. He seeks to eliminate its leadership while leaving a compliant population behind. His soldiers select the most capable and talented, with the vision of talent recruiters, princes who might lead future uprisings, craftsmen whose abilities could reinforce enemy forces, warriors whose knowledge could inspire opposition. 10,000 souls march eastward in shackles, their feet raising dust storms that suspend over the Jerusalem road like funeral clouds. Among them walks Daniel, whose visions will sustain his population through the dark decades approaching. Ezekiel the priest trudges beside nobles and artisans, his mind already receiving the peculiar prophetic dreams that will reshape Jewish comprehension of God's presence and intention. The temple observes this departure with golden vision that reflects nothing but vacancy. Sacred containers disappear into Babylonian wagons, not yet as spoils, but as security against future rebellion. The communication is plain: behave and these treasures might return. Revolt and forfeit everything. Nebuchadnezzar installs Zedekiah as puppet monarch, a son of Josiah selected for his weakness rather than his power. The Babylonian emperor extracts solemn pledges of allegiance sworn before Judah's God and Babylon's deities alike. These pledges carry the significance of both political requirement and religious duty. Yet Zedekiah possesses neither his father Josiah's faith nor his nephew Jehoiachin's bravery. He governs by the permission of foreign masters while confronting the perpetual pressure of native patriots who perceive compromise as betrayal. Egyptian gold proves more compelling than Babylonian threats. Pharaoh's commitments more appealing than vassalage to distant Babylon. The revolt, when it ultimately arrives, surprises nobody except perhaps Zedekiah himself. Egyptian encouragement converts gradual resistance into open insurrection. Tribute remittances cease. Babylonian administrators discover themselves unwelcome, and Jerusalem's ramparts once again prepare for siege. Nebuchadnezzar's second campaign proves different from the initial one. Longer, more savage, more thorough in its devastation. This time the Babylonian monarch arrives not to extract tribute, but to eliminate a persistent source of rebellion. The siege apparatus that once appeared satisfied to batter the ramparts now seeks complete annihilation. This siege extends through seasons, then years. Food diminishes within Jerusalem's ramparts, then vanishes completely. Citizens who once lived in luxury fight over fragments of leather boiled for broth. Mothers conceal their deceased children from neighbors who might take the small corpses for sustenance. The city transforms into a charnel house where survival supersedes every other consideration. Inside the temple, the priests sustain the daily offering as long as lambs can be located, pause, then as long as doves remain, pause, finally offering whatever they can obtain. Even as catapult stones crash into the outer courtyards, even as battering rams shake the very foundations, the morning and evening sacrifices persist. Faith endures, even as hope diminishes. The temple coffers finance the final desperate resistance. Golden containers that once contained sacred wine become coins to compensate mercenaries who have no other motivation to perish for Judah. Silver trumpets that once heralded festivals are liquefied to acquire weapons that cannot reverse the inevitable. When the ramparts ultimately collapse, they fall not merely from Babylonian attack, but from the burden of accumulated judgment. The city that rejected God's cautions confronts God's fury. The population who disregarded prophetic appeals for repentance discovers that divine patience has boundaries. The bronze pillars that flank the temple entrance, Jachin and Boaz, meaning he establishes, and in him is strength, are shattered apart and transported eastward as scrap metal. The irony penetrates more profoundly than Babylonian blades. The emblems of God's establishment and power become testimonies to human rebellion and divine judgment. Fire devours the dwelling that required 7 years to construct, that stood for over 4 centuries as the focal point of Jewish worship, that represented everything the chosen population comprehended about their connection with their God. The cedar timbers from Lebanon crackle and burn like kindling. The gold covering liquefies and flows like tears down the stone surfaces. The unthinkable has occurred. The impossible has become unavoidable. The residence of the living God lies in ruins. And the God who once committed to dwell there permanently has withdrawn like smoke ascending from the devastation, banishment, and reverberations. Beside the waterways of Babylon, the exiles occupy in stunned quietness, their weeping joining the historic waters that flow toward far-off oceans. Their harps suspend from willow branches like shattered aspirations. Their voices silenced by sorrow too profound for melody. The taunting voices of their captors resonate across the water. Sing us one of the songs of Zion. Entertain us with your religious melodies. Yet how can they sing the Lord's song in a foreign territory? How can voices trained for temple worship perform like street entertainers for pagan amusement? The very petition reveals the chasm between those who comprehend sacred music and those who perceive it merely as cultural curiosity. The temple is vanished, reduced to charred stones and bitter recollection. Yet its absence burns more intensely in exile spirits than its presence ever did in Jerusalem. Elderly priests who once ministered at the altar describe the holy furnishings to children who never witnessed its shine in morning sunlight. Their phrases paint pictures more vivid than actuality, recollections more golden than the gold that existed. Levites, who once directed temple choruses, instruct songs to voices that have never heard their resonance from sacred surfaces. The melodies endure, even when the structure that gave them significance lies in devastation. Music becomes portable sanctuary. Rhythm converts into portable holiness. In Babylon, something unprecedented materializes. Faith without a temple, pause. Worship without sacrifice, pause. Holiness without geography. The exile compels brutal innovation. If God cannot be worshipped in his dwelling, perhaps he can be worshipped in human spirits. If the temple is vanished, perhaps the population themselves must become temples. Synagogues materialize like flowers following desert rainfall. Small assemblies, where Torah is recited and remembered, pause. Where prayers rise without altar smoke, pause. Where community forms around word rather than structure. These simple gatherings become laboratories for a new kind of worship, proving grounds for portable faith. The Hebrew language itself begins to transform in exile, absorbing Aramaic influences, developing new theological vocabularies for experiences that previous generations never confronted. How do you articulate God's presence when his dwelling lies in devastation? How do you maintain covenant connection when covenant markers have been annihilated? Ezekiel the priest becomes Ezekiel the prophet in ways that transform both functions. Removed from temple ministry by exile, he discovers prophetic purpose in displacement. His visions blur the boundary between dream and actuality, between recollection and hope, between what was forfeited and what might yet be recovered. In visions that defy description, he witnesses the divine presence withdrawing from Jerusalem before the city's ultimate collapse. The glory of the Lord, which once saturated Solomon's temple so thoroughly that priests could not stand to minister, ascends slowly from the Holy of Holies, pauses at the temple threshold, hovers over the city ramparts, then vanishes toward the east. Yet beyond departure, Ezekiel witnesses promised restoration. A new temple, flawlessly symmetrical, ascends in his prophetic sight like an architectural vision made tangible. This future sanctuary exceeds even Solomon's masterpiece in both magnitude and magnificence, its measurements exact to the cubit, its design reflecting divine rather than human imagination. Rivers flow from this visionary temple's threshold, life-bestowing waters that heal the Dead Sea. Pause. Convert desert wasteland into garden paradise. Pause. Bring vitality wherever they touch. Trees flourish along these riverbanks, producing fruit every month. Their foliage possessing healing characteristics, their harvest never depleting. Ezekiel's vision carries practical implications alongside its mystical imagery. Exact measurements suggest actual blueprints. Detailed floor plans imply future construction. Careful descriptions of gates and chambers speak of hope anchored in concrete anticipation rather than vague, wishful speculation. Daniel, now an elderly man serving in Babylon's royal court, examines ancient prophecies with the intensity of a scholar pursuing hidden treasure. Jeremiah had articulated 70 years of banishment before restoration becomes achievable. The young Hebrew, who once refused the monarch's provisions, now calculates the conclusion of captivity with mathematical exactness. His own visions add complexity to Ezekiel's architectural aspirations. 4 empires will ascend and descend before God's kingdom arrives in authority. Babylon itself, the destroyer of the first temple, will surrender to Media-Persia, pause, then to Greece, pause, finally to Rome. History unfolds according to divine schedule. Human empires ascending and descending like waves on an eternal beach. The exile community develops institutions that will outlast the temple they grieve. Schools materialize where Torah is examined with intensity born of desperation. If the structure is vanished, the instruction must be maintained. Scribes labor with fevered dedication, gathering scattered prophecies, organizing ancient laws, compiling the narratives that define their character as God's chosen population. What was once oral tradition becomes written text out of sheer requirement. The exile compels Israel to inscribe what it might otherwise have forgotten, to systematize what was once assumed, to preserve in permanent form what was previously passed from generation to generation through living voices. The scribes confront monumental choices. Which prophecies are genuine? Which laws are binding? Which narratives carry divine power? Their selections will form Judaism for millennia, determining which texts become scripture and which fade into historical curiosity. Psalms emerge from Babylonian soil like wheat growing in foreign fields. Songs of yearning pierce the spirit with their beauty. By the waterways of Babylon, there we occupied and wept when we remembered Zion. Prayers for restoration ascend from broken spirits. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. These exile psalms capture emotions that transcend their historical instant. Future generations, confronting their own losses and displacements, will discover their deepest feelings expressed in phrases written beside Mesopotamian canals. Lament becomes liturgy, sorrow converts into worship. The temple's absence paradoxically makes its presence more powerful in Jewish consciousness. In dreams visiting sleepless exiles, pause. In prayers ascending from broken spirits, pause. In careful preservation of ritual knowledge that may never again be practiced, pause. The destroyed sanctuary expands larger than it ever was in existence. Recollection becomes more powerful than actuality. The temple that existed in history, with its political compromises and periodic corruptions, yields to the temple of ideal imagination, perfect in its holiness. Pause. Complete in its ministry to God. Pause. Eternal in its significance. Persian armies accumulate power in the eastern peaks like storm clouds, building toward inevitable release. Cyrus the Great, monarch of a population the exiles barely recognize, conquers Media, pause, then Lydia, pause, then the remnants of Babylon's empire. His victories arrive with stunning rapidity, as if divinely orchestrated. When Babylon collapses, It collapses not to siege and annihilation, but to internal disintegration and strategic betrayal. The city that annihilated Jerusalem opens its gates to Persian occupation without a battle. The empire that appeared invincible proves surprisingly delicate when its time concludes. Cyrus's initial royal proclamation sends tremors through exiled communities dispersed across the former Babylonian Empire. Let the population of Judah return to their homeland. Let them rebuild their God's dwelling. Let them recover what was annihilated. The impossible becomes unavoidable once again, but this time in reverse. The banishment that appeared permanent proves temporary. The temple that seemed forever forfeited shows signs of resurrection. The population who thought they would perish in foreign soil suddenly confront the prospect of going home. Yet home is a phrase that signifies different things to different generations. For the elderly exiles who remember Jerusalem, home signifies return to familiar pathways and sacred locations. For their children born in Babylon, home might signify the only territory they've ever known. For their grandchildren, home becomes an abstract concept, a location of narratives rather than recollection. The appeal to return divides the exiled community along generational boundaries. Some pack immediately, eager to witness the territory their grandparents described in countless bedtime narratives. Others hesitate, unwilling to relinquish prosperity and protection for uncertain adventure in a half-forgotten homeland. The choice becomes an examination of faith as profound as any their ancestors confronted. Abraham departed Mesopotamia for Canaan on God's commitment alone. Now his descendants confront the reverse journey, abandoning Mesopotamian luxury for Canaanite uncertainty. Pause, trusting divine faithfulness across the centuries. Restoration and reconstruction. The road returning to Jerusalem extends longer than recollection, dustier than hope, more challenging than dreams suggested. 42,000 souls assemble for the journey, but their number signifies only a portion of the scattered exile population. Many Jews have selected to remain in Mesopotamia, where they have constructed successful existences, raised families, established businesses that flourish under Persian governance. Those who select restoration carry beyond personal possessions. They bear the sacred containers that Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers overlooked in their haste. The sacred treasures that devoted priests concealed before the final assault, vessels of gold and bowls of silver that remained hidden in shadow, waiting for this hour of renewal. Leading the initial group is Sheshbazzar, a prince from Judah, who carries both the royal insignia and Persian approval to reconstruct. Walking behind him comes Zerubbabel, the grandson of King Jehoiakim, an inheritor of David's royal line, representing unbroken continuity despite the exiled generations that stand between him and his ancestral realm. Moving alongside them is Joshua, serving as high priest, a descendant of Aaron who preserves sacrificial practices that persisted even on foreign soil. His understanding creates a bridge between former days and possible future days, between the sanctuary that fell and the sanctuary that may yet rise once more. The journey extends across months, threading through territories that shifted control repeatedly throughout the decades of captivity. Persian administrative regions have replaced the kingdoms their ancestors remembered. Different peoples now inhabit lands that previously belonged to nations of old. The world continued forward during their time away. The returning exiles find Jerusalem's devastation shocking beyond words. Wild plants push up through palace floors where monarchs once governed. The temple platform stands empty, save for charred foundation stones and untamed thorns, claiming what were once holy courtyards. Jackals make dens where the most sacred chamber once sheltered the Ark of God. The city fortifications, shattered during that final assault and left unrepaired, provide no defense against robbers or dangerous animals. Dwellings remain without roofs, their former occupants either deceased or long departed. The Jerusalem preserved in memory resembles little of the reality confronting these returning exiles. Still, Hope begins stirring among the wreckage like fresh growth emerging through scorched soil. These ancient stones remember Solomon's dedication ceremony, David's celebration dance, the numerous festivals that previously filled these courtyards with celebration. The land itself appears to receive the exiles back home, responding to their arrival with quiet indicators of reviving life. The returning exiles confront the essential question facing every generation. Should they build for personal needs first, or restore the house of God, clear their private fields, or clear the Temple Mount, establish individual safety, or re-establish collective worship? Human instinct draws toward self-protection, yet prophetic voices call toward heavenly priorities. Slowly, almost hesitantly, labor commences on the temple location. Foundation stones get positioned again upon the original site. Each stone is set with prayers and weeping. Every measurement gets verified against memories maintained throughout decades of displacement. The foundation-laying ritual reveals the emotional complexity inherent in restoration. Elderly men who recall Solomon's temple in its magnificence weep upon seeing the humble scale of this new structure. Their tears spring not from happiness but from grief. This reconstruction cannot equal what was lost. This second sanctuary will never match the first in splendor. Meanwhile, younger men who know Jerusalem solely through exile narratives shout with happiness at witnessing any temple ascending on Mount Moriah. Their rejoicing flows from hope instead of remembrance. For these younger ones, this structure signifies not reduction, but commencement, not deterioration, but renewal. The sounds of mourning blend with cries of celebration until distinguishing between them becomes impossible. Grief and jubilation become inseparable, producing a layered emotional harmony, capturing the ambiguous character of all human restoration. What gets rebuilt never quite equals what was destroyed. Yet, it holds its own worth and significance. Opposition emerges from unexpected sources, generating challenges the exiles never foresaw. The populations who stayed in the territory during exile, mixed communities, foreign transplants brought by Assyrian and Babylonian strategies, descendants of northern Israel who intermarried with pagan populations, approach with proposals sounding generous, yet carrying concealed complications. "We also worship your God," they announce with seeming earnestness. "We have offered sacrifices to the Lord of Heaven since the era of Esarhaddon, who relocated us here. Allow us to construct together. Let us labor as unified people toward unified purpose." Their proposition seems sensible, even appealing. The returning exiles desperately require assistance with the massive reconstruction task. Extra laborers would accelerate the endeavor. Combined resources would ease individual loads. Joint effort would fortify the small community against outside dangers. However, Zerubbabel rejects their proposal with firmness approaching severity. The returned exiles, he maintains, must finish this labor independently. They alone represent the genuine covenant inheritors, the rightful descendants of David and Solomon, the authentic Israel that preserved its identity through exile purification. This choice breeds bitterness that will echo across centuries. The spurned peoples, who later become known as Samaritans, shift from potential allies to active adversaries. Their injured pride transforms into resolute antagonism, seeking to block what they cannot join. Letters travel eastward toward the Persian court, delivered by experienced scribes who grasp how to construct legal reasoning in language gaining royal notice. These writings assert the Jews are reconstructing Jerusalem not for religious purposes, but for insurrection, not to serve the Persian monarch, but to challenge his rule. The charges follow recognizable patterns. These people possess a rebellion history. They toppled kingdoms in former times. They will generate problems if permitted to strengthen their city. Archaeological remains validate their assertions. The ruins testify to Jerusalem's devastation by Babylon, evidence that this city once resisted imperial control. Persian administrators experienced in managing restless provinces and potential uprisings lean toward prudence. Building halts by royal command, while imperial officials investigate the allegations and rebuttals flowing from this remote section of their enormous empire. Years drag by in exasperation, while the partially completed temple stands as a monument to interrupted aspirations. The altar operates again. Sacrifices resume their traditional rhythms, yet the building itself stays unfinished. Scaffolding weathers under wind and precipitation. Foundation stones accumulate dust. Laborers drift toward different endeavors. The community battles with discouragement, reaching deeper than postponed construction. If God desired them to reconstruct his dwelling, why did he permit this resistance? If their return was divinely arranged, why do human barriers prove so challenging to surmount? Faith struggles against circumstances in the continuous battle to sustain hope. Then, fresh voices emerge, with messages cutting through despair like blades through shadow. Haggai, the prophet, moves among the disheartened workers, posing sharp questions, exposing their displaced priorities. Is this the proper time for you to reside in your finished houses while this dwelling remains in devastation? His statements sting because they contain truth. The returnees have concentrated on individual prosperity while overlooking communal duty. Their personal residences are completed and equipped, while God's dwelling remains skeletal and incomplete. Haggai links their financial difficulties to their spiritual choices with prophetic perception, connecting cause with consequence. You have planted abundantly but gathered scarcely because you attend to your personal dwellings, while my dwelling lies abandoned. You receive wages only to place them in containers with openings because your priorities are reversed. Zechariah joins Haggai's appeal with visions lifting attention from present disappointment to coming magnificence. He perceives a temple crowned with heavenly approval that will attract all peoples to worship in Jerusalem. His prophecies describe silver and gold streaming to the sanctuary, divine radiance filling the modest structure with brilliance, surpassing Solomon's accomplishment. Not through human strength, nor through human force, Zechariah announces, but through God's Spirit will this temple reach completion. The barriers appearing insurmountable will transform into passages. The mountains of challenge will flatten into plains of possibility. The labor restarts with renewed energy born from refreshed vision. Persian investigation into the legal matters finally produces results. Historical records verify Cyrus's initial decree permitting temple reconstruction. Imperial approval flows down the administrative hierarchy. Not only may the Jews resume building, they must obtain governmental support to finish their work. In 4 years of concentrated effort, the Second Temple stands finished on its historical location. More modest than Solomon's achievement, less decorated in adornment, humbler in dimension, yet genuine. The flame ignites again on the bronze altar. Priests return to their ceremonial duties. The divine presence comes back to reside among his people. The dedication ritual cannot replicate the supernatural drama of Solomon's dedication. No cloud occupies the sanctuary, preventing priestly activity. No fire devours the offering in visible demonstration of heavenly acceptance. The divine presence arrives quietly, without spectacle, like daybreak spreading over familiar terrain. Still, celebration fills the temple courtyards as the community dedicates their spirits alongside their structure. What they have achieved signifies more than building. It proves faith enduring through disappointment, hope weathering resistance, dedication exceeding comfort. The Second Temple launches its extended history as the focal point of renewed Jewish existence. Smaller than what preceded it, yet meaningful beyond its proportions, humble in presentation, yet magnificent in importance, it stands testifying to the reality that God's dwelling among his people relies less on architectural greatness than on devoted hearts. The Second Temple faces trials. The reconstructed temple encounters centuries of testing that would challenge any generation's faith. Persian authority, which permitted the reconstruction and backed the early restoration, yields to Greek domination when Alexander the Macedonian surges across the ancient world like summer wildfire, devouring kingdoms, appearing permanent, toppling empires, seeming eternal. The youthful conqueror visits Jerusalem during his lightning advance through the Persian territories, his arrival generating more fascination than alarm among the Jewish residents. Unlike other conquerors, viewing local religions as threats to their control, Alexander demonstrates authentic regard for the temple and its practices, respecting the high priest and presenting sacrifices following Jewish tradition. His visit proves brief yet important. The Jews read his respectful conduct as heavenly blessing, proof that their God can operate through pagan monarchs, just as he previously operated through Cyrus. Alexander's visit transforms into legend, enhanced with each retelling until history and wonder become indistinguishable. Yet Alexander perishes at 33 in faraway Babylon, his empire shattering like pottery striking stone. His commanders divide the known world among themselves, establishing kingdoms that will consume the following 3 centuries, battling over fragments of his broken inheritance. The temple becomes trapped between competing kingdoms as Ptolemaic Egypt and Seleucid Syria conduct proxy conflicts across Palestinian territory. Jerusalem switches control repeatedly, transferred back and forth like a war prize, its temple sometimes respected by accepting rulers, sometimes endangered by those perceiving Jewish distinctiveness as political defiance. Under the Ptolemies of Alexandria, temple existence continues much as it did under Persian governance. The Egyptian Greeks demonstrate general acceptance of local practices, viewing religious variety as politically beneficial rather than threatening. Jewish priests sustain their traditional ceremonies, while Alexandria becomes a hub of Jewish scholarship, rivaling Jerusalem itself. However, when the Seleucids of Antioch acquire authority over Palestine, the circumstances shift with dramatic abruptness. These Syrian Greeks carry different presumptions about culture and governance, different requirements about religious uniformity, different approaches to managing diverse populations. King Antiochus III conquers Palestine from Egypt, yet maintains his predecessor's strategy of religious acceptance. The temple obtains royal backing, priests possess traditional advantages. Jewish law administers Jewish communities throughout the Seleucid Empire. The transition appears seamless, nearly invisible. His offspring, Antiochus IV, who assumes the designation Epiphanes, meaning God manifest, introduces drastically different concepts about cultural unity and religious conduct. Where his father viewed diversity as acceptable, he perceives it as dangerous. Where earlier rulers tolerated local traditions, he demands universal adherence to Greek culture and Greek deities. The crisis commences with seemingly minor concessions, slipping into Jerusalem existence like water penetrating cracks in stone. Greek language becomes stylish among the prosperous. Greek practices gain appeal among the aspirational. Greek names supplant Hebrew names in refined society. Young priests study Greek rhetoric and philosophy, adopting Greek mannerisms and Greek principles. Some even pursue surgery to disguise their circumcision when joining Greek athletic contests, eliminating the physical covenant mark to prevent embarrassment in the gymnasium. Jason, brother of the high priest Onias, presents Antiochus an enormous payment for the advantage of converting Jerusalem into a Greek city complete with gymnasium and theatre. The monarch accepts enthusiastically. Greek cities contribute more revenue than traditional communities. Greek culture generates more dependable subjects than ancestral religions. The transformation quickens beyond anyone's anticipation. A gymnasium appears near the Temple Mount, where young men train unclothed following Greek tradition. Greek celebrations rival Jewish holy days for public focus. Greek gods receive veneration in a city that previously acknowledged only the Lord's name. Some Jews embrace these modifications as advancement as entering the broader Mediterranean civilization, as progressing beyond the restrictive boundaries of ancient custom. They perceive Greek culture as refined and Jewish tradition as primitive, Greek philosophy as enlightened and Jewish law as limiting. Others resist with increasing concern, viewing each innovation as covenant betrayal, defining their identity. They observe their neighbors forsaking circumcision, disregarding Sabbath practice, consuming prohibited foods, and marrying beyond the faith with alarm deepening into desperation. Antiochus drives his cultural transformation beyond tolerance boundaries. He prohibits Sabbath observance as royal authority defiance, bans circumcision as savage mutilation, orders Torah scroll burning as seditious material. What started as cultural pressure becomes religious oppression. The ultimate violation arrives when Antiochus enters the Holy of Holies personally, an action prohibited even to Jewish priests. He plunders the temple treasury, funding his conflicts, removes gold from sacred implements, carries away treasures representing centuries of collected devotion. Yet even this desecration dims beside what follows. On the 25th day of Kislev, in the year 167 BCE, an altar to Zeus Olympios gets constructed on the location where the burnt offering altar previously stood. Greek soldiers compel Jews to consume swine flesh or face death, transforming the temple courtyards into scenes of martyrdom and betrayal. Pigs get sacrificed where lambs previously bled for sin offerings, their blood spattering stones dedicated to worshipping the one true God. The abomination causing desolation, prophesied by Daniel centuries prior, defiles the courtyards where innumerable generations brought their prayers and gifts. In the village of Modi'in, northwest of Jerusalem, an aged priest named Mattathias confronts the ultimate faith test when royal representatives arrive with their demands and their warnings. Sacrifice to Greek gods they command, and prosper. Refuse and perish as a traitor to the monarch. Mattathias's answer reverberates across the centuries like a battle cry, still inspiring bravery in testing times. Though all the peoples under the king's authority obey him and abandon everyone the religion of their ancestors, yet will I and my offspring and my kinsmen walk in the covenant of our fathers. When a fellow Jew approaches the pagan altar presenting the mandatory sacrifice, Mattathias strikes him down with righteous anger, then attacks the king's representative and kills him as well. His 5 offspring rally around their father as he raises the traditional war summons. Whoever shows zeal for the law and upholds the covenant, let him follow me. The Maccabean uprising commences that day with a handful of men escaping to the mountains with bounties on their heads. What begins as desperate resistance by religious zealots develops into comprehensive guerrilla combat, spreading across the Judean countryside like flames through dried grass. Judas, called Maccabeus, the Hammer, surfaces as the military strategist who converts desperation into triumph. His small groups of faithful Jews attack Syrian garrisons, then disappear back into the wilderness. They understand better than their adversaries. Hit-and-run methods become refined skill. Nighttime assaults become famous. Improbable victories become standard. Against all probability, against greater numbers and superior equipment, against the organized power of the Seleucid Empire, the rebellion prevails. Judas and his kinsmen retake Jerusalem, expel the Syrian troops, reclaim the Temple Mount in victory, appearing impossible just 3 years earlier. They discover the sanctuary in ruins, breaking their hearts while fortifying their determination. Wild plants grow through fractured courtyard stones. Untamed creatures nest in the sacred chambers. The golden altar bears stains of pig's blood that no scrubbing amount can eliminate. The purification work commences immediately and advances with religious fervor. Stones contaminated by pagan sacrifice cannot be purified. They must get replaced completely. Fresh stones cut from untouched quarries and handled exclusively by consecrated hands create a new altar on the historical location. The golden menorah carried away as plunder must get replaced with whatever gold the community can contribute. Craftsmen labor with passionate commitment to recreate sacred implements from memory and incomplete descriptions. Understanding their work will serve God's worship for coming generations. When the temple cleansing finishes, the community celebrates with 8 days of dedication, remembered as Hanukkah, the festival of lights. Happiness replaces sadness, hope defeats despair. Light conquers darkness in ways both physical and symbolic. The oil miracle becomes fundamental to Hanukkah tradition. Only one small container of properly consecrated oil gets found among the temple provisions, enough to burn for 1 day while fresh oil gets prepared following ritual specifications. Yet the single-day supply burns for 8 days, providing illumination until proper oil can substitute it. Whether miracle or prudent conservation, the account captures the moment's essence. Light returning to the temple courtyards, divine presence resuming its dwelling among faithful people, hope surviving even the deepest persecution. However, independence proves delicate as morning vapor. The Maccabees, who started as religious resistance warriors, become the Hasmonean dynasty, transforming from liberation champions into political governors who encounter all the compromises and corruptions that authority brings. What originated as pure religious drive becomes blended with political desire. The priestly family that rescued the temple from pagan contamination ultimately claims both royal and priestly power, merging roles intended to stay separated, consolidating authority in ways corrupting even worthy intentions. The temple survives the Maccabean crisis, emerges from persecution more robust than previously, resumes its position as the hub of Jewish religious existence. Yet the seeds of coming conflicts get planted during these struggle years. Conflicts between religious purity and political practicality, between faithful resistance and practical compromise, between divine calling and human aspiration. Herod's temple represents a magnificent deception. A fresh power ascends in the west, like the sun itself, its radiance spreading across the Mediterranean realm until no area remains in darkness. Roman legions advance with mechanical exactness across continents, carrying their eagles to territories that previously knew only local monarchs, their regulations to peoples who existed by traditional customs, their deities to nations that worshipped in ways Rome scarcely comprehends. The great kingdoms emerging from Alexander's conquests topple like dominoes before Roman effectiveness. Macedonia transforms into a province. Syria yields to Roman governance. Egypt submits to Caesar's successor. The world, appearing permanently Greek, converts into something Roman, something vaster, something more systematized and more lasting. Judea, positioned in the trajectory of Roman expansion, confronts the identical choice facing numerous other peoples: submit willingly or get conquered by strength. The choice appears clear, yet the implementation proves complicated, requiring governors who comprehend both Jewish sensitivities and Roman requirements. Rome selects its local governors with the strategic precision that constructed the empire. They pursue men who can span cultural divisions, who possess the local understanding to avert rebellions and the imperial devotion to serve Roman concerns. In Palestine, their selection falls on Herod, offspring of an Edomite convert, a man poised precariously between worlds. Herod's heritage makes him ideal for Roman objectives and questionable to Jewish perception. Half Jewish through conversion instead of birth, completely Roman by education and preference, he grasps both cultures without belonging entirely to either. His very existence embodies the compromises that survival demands in an occupied territory. The Second Temple, now standing for almost 5 centuries, displays the deterioration of age and the constraints of its humble reconstruction. Compared to the magnificent temples of Rome, Athens, or Alexandria, Jerusalem's sanctuary appears provincial, even shabby. For a monarch with imperial dreams, it constitutes an embarrassing architectural declaration. Herod perceives opportunity in renovation, serving multiple objectives simultaneously. A grander temple will attract Jewish hearts suspicious of his foreign ancestry. A magnificent structure will exhibit Roman engineering excellence to visitors from throughout the empire. A building endeavor will supply employment for thousands while displaying his wealth and authority. His suggestion to Jewish authorities proceeds carefully on ground, made sensitive by centuries of foreign interference. We will reconstruct the temple, he commits, in magnificence, surpassing even Solomon's original achievement. However, the old building must come down entirely before the new can ascend in its position. The priests pause, their wariness born from harsh experience with rulers making grand commitments but delivering disappointment or worse. What if complications arise during building? What if the new temple stays unfinished, like so many imperial undertakings? Their faith would become homeless, their worship without appropriate sanctuary. Herod enhances his suggestion with assurances designed to address religious concerns. The new temple will be entirely prepared before a single stone of the old structure gets removed. 1,000 priests will receive training as stonemasons, ensuring only consecrated hands handle the most sacred labor. Building materials will get assembled beforehand. Plans receive approval from religious officials. Funding gets secured from royal reserves. Nothing will get left to chance. No element overlooked. No sacred requirement disregarded. The endeavor will respect Jewish law while exhibiting royal magnificence. Labor commences around 20 BCE, with preparations rivaling military campaigns in their extent and coordination. Quarries throughout Judea echo with hammer sounds as enormous stones get cut to exact requirements. Some blocks weigh hundreds of tons, demanding innovative engineering just to move them to the construction location. The temple platform itself must get expanded to support Herod's vision. The original modest area sufficient for the returning exile's simple structure cannot accommodate the magnificent complex the monarch imagines. Massive retaining walls ascend to hold artificial fill, doubling the available space. These retaining walls become engineering achievements that impress Roman architects experienced in imperial building endeavors. Stones fit together with exactness, leaving no openings, held in position by their own mass instead of mortar, designed to resist earthquakes and siege equipment with equal success. The structure gradually emerging dazzles everyone witnessing it, visitor and inhabitant alike. White limestone gleams like snow under the Jerusalem sun, its surface polished to mirror brilliance. Gold plates cover the sanctuary facade so thoroughly that looking directly at the structure becomes painful at particular times of day. Josephus, the Jewish historian witnessing the temple in its finished magnificence, searches for words suitable to describe its splendor. From a distance, he records, the temple resembles a mountain blanketed in snow, so radiant is its stone, and so extensive its gold covering. The interior exceeds even the exterior in wealth and beauty. Cedar panels cover the walls with complex carvings rivaling Solomon's original craftsmanship. Golden implements shine in chambers illuminated by innumerable oil lamps. Tapestries woven with valuable threads separate the sacred spaces following ancient specification. Still, something hollow reverberates through this magnificent building despite its unprecedented beauty. The structure bears the unmistakable imprint of political calculation instead of spiritual commitment. Herod constructed it for personal magnificence as much as divine respect, for Roman endorsement as much as Jewish reception. The irony intensifies when considering the builder's personal religious conduct. Herod the Great, architect of the most beautiful temple in Jewish history, venerates Roman gods as readily as Jewish ones, sustains pagan shrines alongside this Jewish masterwork, serves political expedience instead of religious conviction. The priests serving in this golden sanctuary understand their patron's heart stays divided. They conduct their traditional ceremonies in chambers more beautiful than any their predecessors experienced, yet under the sponsorship of a monarch whose devotion belongs to Caesar instead of the covenant. The Ark of the Covenant, missing since Babylon's destruction of the first temple, never returns to occupy the Holy of Holies. The most sacred space in Judaism stays empty except for a simple foundation stone where the ark previously rested, a void symbolizing the spiritual emptiness at the core of this architectural triumph. Pilgrims arrive from across the known world to marvel at Herod's temple, attracted by reports of its unprecedented beauty and magnificence. They leave generous contributions enriching both the temple treasury and the royal funds, their donations flowing like silver and gold rivers into Jerusalem's economy. The temple becomes a tourist attraction as much as a worship hub, a world wonder rivaling the Colossus of Rhodes or the Lighthouse of Alexandria. Roman administrators visit to appreciate the engineering. Greek philosophers arrive to examine Jewish traditions. Merchants come to conduct business in the bustling markets surrounding the sacred complex. Still, the prophetic voices that previously thundered in these courtyards grow increasingly scarce. The divine presence that once occupied Solomon's temple so intensely that priests could not fulfill their responsibilities seems distant, despite the building's enhanced magnificence. Herod's temple embodies the ultimate architectural triumph in Jewish history and the ultimate spiritual contradiction. Never has God's dwelling place appeared more beautiful. Never has it seemed more devoid of the divine presence it was constructed to shelter. The most magnificent temple ever built serves as a monument to compromise, a masterwork of irony, a structure whose beauty cannot compensate for the spiritual hollowness of its creator's drives. It stands testifying to the reality that external magnificence cannot replace internal commitment, that architectural achievement cannot substitute for genuine faith. Jesus in the temple, a young instructor from the northern territory of Galilee, makes his way up the stone steps leading to the Temple Mount, his sandaled feet tracking paths worn smooth by innumerable pilgrims across many centuries. His name is Jesus, and his appearance in this sacred location will transform everything about the temple's significance, function, and final fate. He arrives first as an infant, carried by parents whose poverty compels them to present the sacrifice designated for the poor, 2 young doves instead of a lamb. Joseph and Mary present their firstborn offspring following the law of Moses, satisfying ancient requirements with humble offerings, speaking of faithfulness instead of prosperity. The elderly priest Simeon holds the infant in weathered arms that have embraced countless children brought for dedication. Yet something about this child stirs him to prophetic declaration, echoing through the temple courtyards like distant thunder. Lord, now you're permitting your servant to depart in peace, for my eyes have witnessed your salvation. His words hold threatening undertones alongside their promise. This child is appointed for the falling and rising of many in Israel, destined to become a sign that will face contradiction, a source of separation that will pierce hearts like swords. Even in infancy, Jesus embodies both promise and danger to the established system. The child visits the temple again at 12 years old, his parents discovering him in the courtyards after 3 days of anxious searching. They find him sitting among the instructors, posing questions revealing comprehension far exceeding his years, offering responses astonishing the learned men who have devoted their lives examining sacred writings. His answer to his parents' distress hints at the broader assignment defining his adult ministry. Did you not understand that I must be in my Father's dwelling? The boy's statement establishes a distinctive relationship to the temple, transcending normal religious obligation, suggesting ownership instead of mere visitation. 18 years elapse in apparent obscurity before Jesus returns as a mature instructor with disciples following his every statement. The Gospel authors compress those hidden years into a single sentence, yet they must have included innumerable visits to Jerusalem for celebrations, regular exposure to temple worship, deep familiarity with the patterns of Jewish religious existence. When he surfaces into public ministry, his first major action disrupts the commercial tranquility of the temple's outer courtyards. Money changers scatter as he overturns their tables with righteous anger. Doves flutter free from shattered cages, while coins roll across stone pavement like dispersed seeds. "My dwelling shall be designated a house of prayer for all peoples," he declares, quoting the prophet Isaiah while expelling merchants from the sacred areas. "However, you have transformed it into a thieves' hideout." His actions challenge not just corrupt conduct, but the complete commercial system grown up surrounding temple worship. The temple establishment observes this Galilean instructor with growing alarm, deepening into active resistance. He speaks of the temple's devastation as though it were already determined by divine decision instead of human selection. He asserts authority to pardon sins, a privilege belonging to God alone and mediated solely through the temple's sacrificial arrangement. His teaching holds implicit challenges to temple power that cannot be disregarded. When he heals the sick, he circumvents the priests who traditionally certified ritual purity. When he pronounces sins pardoned, he removes the necessity for guilt offerings. When he receives outcasts, he undermines the purity arrangement defining temple religion. The parables he presents cut deeply into the religious establishment's sense of protection and advantage. The account of wicked tenants who decline to give the vineyard owner his portion, who assault his servants and murder his son, addresses directly their circumstances. The chief priests grasp perfectly. They are the tenants. The temple is the vineyard, and judgment approaches like storm clouds on the horizon. His cleansing of the temple courtyards occurs not once, but twice, framing his ministry with symbolic actions, defining his complete assignment. The first cleansing announces his entrance as one possessing authority over sacred location. The final cleansing proclaims his judgment on an institution, failing its divine objective. During his final week in Jerusalem, Jesus weeps over the city with tears, speaking of divine heartbreak. "If you, even you, had only recognized on this day what would bring you peace," he grimaced. "However, now it is concealed from your eyes." His sorrow holds the weight of rejected love and spurned mercy. He speaks plainly now about the temple's approaching destiny, his words striking his disciples like physical impacts. "Do you perceive all these magnificent structures? Not one stone will remain on another. Everyone will get thrown down." His prophecy encompasses not just architectural devastation, but the conclusion of a complete religious arrangement. His disciples, gazing up at Herod's magnificent fortifications with their precisely fitted stones and golden decorations, can scarcely comprehend such statements. How could this beautiful structure, this hub of their religious world, this dwelling place of God himself, possibly face total destruction? Yet Jesus perceives what they cannot. The spiritual vacancy behind architectural magnificence, the corruption concealed beneath religious ritual, the judgment accumulating when institutions forget their divine objective. The temple has transformed into an end in itself, instead of a means to encounter God. The final confrontation arrives during Passover week, when Jerusalem swells with pilgrims and tensions escalate between Roman occupation troops and Jewish national dreams. Jesus enters the temple courtyards one final time, instructing crowds who hang on his every statement, while authorities scheme in shadows cast by the very fortifications he has condemned. They arrest him at night away from the temple crowds who might protect him, in a garden across the valley where olive trees witness the commencement of his suffering. The trial, execution, and burial happen with rapid effectiveness, designed to eliminate a troublesome instructor before his influence spreads further. However, 3 days later, his followers assert the impossible, that death could not retain him, that the grave could not hold him, that resurrection has transformed everything about the human situation. The temple priests labor frantically to suppress these reports, posting guards, circulating alternative explanations, intimidating anyone who mentions risen existence. Their attempts prove ineffective. The message spreads like wildfire through the very temple courtyards where it commenced, conveyed by voices that cannot be quieted, proclaimed by witnesses who will not be frightened. Something essential has shifted in the spiritual landscape. A fresh movement surfaces, centering not on the temple structure, but on the person of Jesus. His followers continue worshipping in the temple courtyards from habit and heritage, yet they also assemble in homes for a different kind of worship, breaking bread together, sharing the simple meal their instructor instituted, experiencing community transcending traditional religious boundaries. The temple still stands in all its Herodian magnificence, still operates following ancient patterns, still attracts pilgrims from across the Mediterranean realm, priests still present daily sacrifices. Celebrations still mark the sacred calendar. The old patterns continue as they have for centuries. However, something fundamental has shifted. These Jesus followers speak of their bodies as temples, their hearts as holy locations, their community as the dwelling place of God's Spirit. They proclaim a kingdom not constructed with human hands, worship requiring no particular location, priesthood belonging to all believers instead of a hereditary class. The old system senses the danger even when it cannot express the threat precisely. These followers of the executed instructor embody more than another Jewish sect. They represent a completely different comprehension of how God relates to humanity, how worship links earth to heaven, how the divine presence dwells among mortal beings. The temple's days are numbered not by Roman politics, but by divine intention. The structure that Herod made magnificent will collapse not because of its architectural weaknesses, but because its spiritual purpose has been satisfied and transcended. The arrangement it represents, mediated access to God through building, priesthood, and sacrifice, yields to immediate relationship through the risen Christ. Jesus' prophecy about the temple's devastation holds deeper significance than anyone initially grasps. He speaks not just of stones tumbling down, but of a complete religious arrangement becoming obsolete, not just of structural collapse, but of spiritual transformation, making such structures unnecessary. The carpenter from Nazareth, who mastered his craft, shaping wood and stone, now shapes history itself. His death and resurrection accomplish what no temple ever could: permanent reconciliation between God and humanity, eternal access to the divine presence, complete forgiveness, requiring no repeated sacrifice. The temple still stands, magnificent in morning sunlight, golden in evening radiance. Yet its time is concluding, its purpose satisfied, its significance transformed by the one who designated it his Father's dwelling and then became the dwelling place of God among humanity. Fire and remembrance. The tensions, commencing with a carpenter from Nazareth, explode into open conflict, consuming the territory like wildfire, racing across drought-stricken terrain. Jewish rebels, driven by traditional dreams of independence and inflamed by prophetic passion, rise against Roman government with desperate bravery, substituting enthusiasm for practical planning. The uprising spreads beyond anyone's anticipations or management. What commences as scattered resistance in remote settlements develops into coordinated rebellion, threatening Roman control throughout Palestine. Tax gatherers abandon their stations. Roman administrators barricade themselves in fortified facilities. The carefully sustained peace, permitting commerce and pilgrimage, disintegrates into disorder. Zealots seize authority of Jerusalem itself, their radical perspective transforming the holy city into a fortress of religious nationalism. They perceive their struggle in cosmic dimensions. This is the ultimate battle between good and evil, between God's chosen people and the godless peoples oppressing them. Surely the Almighty will intervene as he did in Hezekiah's era against Assyria, as he did in Maccabean times against Greece. Rome responds with the systematic effectiveness that constructed and sustains the empire. Emperor Vespasian leads 4 complete legions into the rebellious territory, bringing siege equipment, engineers, auxiliary forces, and the accumulated military knowledge of centuries of domination. The rebellion, appearing so promising, suddenly confronts professional resistance. City after city falls to Roman siegecraft with grinding inevitability: Jotapata, Tarichae, Gamala. Each fortress, appearing impregnable, proves vulnerable to Roman patience and engineering expertise. The rebels retreat steadily southward, their numbers reduced by combat and desertion, their hope sustained solely by faith in divine intervention. Jerusalem becomes the ultimate stronghold, its massive fortifications offering the final hope of successful resistance. The city swells with refugees from fallen towns, religious pilgrims trapped by the conflict's timing, zealots determined to make their ultimate stand at the temple itself. Titus, Vespasian's offspring, assumes authority when his father departs to claim the imperial throne vacated by Nero's death. The siege of Jerusalem becomes the young commander's opportunity to demonstrate himself worthy of future imperial duty while eliminating a persistent source of provincial unrest. The siege extends through seasons, blending into years of mounting horror. Food becomes scarce within the fortifications, then vanishes entirely as Roman lines block any provisions from reaching the starving defenders. Citizens who previously lived in comfort battle over scraps of leather boiled into bitter soup. Josephus, the Jewish historian who joined the Roman cause following his personal military defeat, stands outside Jerusalem's fortifications, pleading with defenders he previously fought beside. "Surrender now," he cries, through the smoke and dust, "and preserve the temple. Continue this hopeless resistance and observe God's dwelling burn to ashes." His statements fall on ears deafened by starvation and religious fanaticism. The defenders cannot believe that God would permit his dwelling place to be destroyed by pagan armies. The temple has survived Babylonian domination, Greek oppression, innumerable smaller dangers. Surely divine protection will prove stronger than Roman siege equipment. Inside the temple complex, priests sustain the daily sacrifices, as long as animals can be located, then as long as grain remains for offerings, finally presenting whatever scraps their desperate searches discover. Even as catapult stones crash into the outer courtyards, even as battering rams shake the traditional gates, the morning and evening offerings continue with religious commitment, transcending circumstances. The temple treasury, swollen by centuries of pilgrims' contributions and prudent financial administration, funds the ultimate resistance with gold that previously purchased frankincense and silver that previously bought sacrificial animals. Sacred implements become common currency. Holy cups transform into payment for mercenaries, possessing no other reason to perish, defending Jewish religious independence. Mothers conceal the bodies of their deceased children from neighbors who might take them for food. Starvation reduces human beings to animals. Desperation overrides every moral boundary. The holy city becomes a charnel house where survival trumps every other consideration. When the Romans finally penetrate Jerusalem's outer defenses, they pour into the city like an iron flood. Nothing can redirect or halt. Street combat rages through narrow passages. House-to-house fighting converts residential neighborhoods into battlefields. The sound of clashing weapons reverberates off stone fortifications day and night. The defenders retreat to their ultimate stronghold, the Temple Mount itself, where massive fortifications and sacred importance combine to offer the final hope of miraculous deliverance. If God intends to rescue his people, surely he will act now to protect his personal dwelling place. What happens next remains disputed by historical sources, the confusion of combat obscuring exact details that later generations would desperately desire to comprehend. Some accounts assert Titus ordered the temple preserved as a magnificent trophy of Roman triumph. Others maintain that a Roman soldier, maddened by the carnage and desperate to conclude the siege, hurled a burning brand into the sanctuary against explicit commands. The result transcends the intentions of any human participant. Fire engulfs the cedar panels and golden implements, the silk curtains and wooden furnishings, representing centuries of accumulated commitment and artistic achievement. The temple, requiring decades to construct, burns in hours, its devastation visible from mountains miles distant. Titus himself observes the conflagration with emotions that contemporary historians struggle to portray. The destruction serves Roman military objectives by removing the focal point of Jewish resistance. Yet it also signifies the loss of one of the world's architectural wonders, a structure impressing even Roman engineers experienced in imperial magnificence. The sacred implements surviving the initial fire, the golden menorah, the silver trumpets, the showbread table overlaid with precious metal, become trophies in Titus's triumph parade through Rome's streets. Jewish treasures previously serving God's worship now celebrate Roman victory, their presence in the procession symbolizing the complete defeat of Jewish independence. Roman soldiers plow the Temple Mount with salt, following traditional customs designed to ensure nothing holy or significant can ever grow on the location again. The gesture appears definitive, final, absolute. The dwelling place of the Jewish God has been eliminated forever. However, salt proves less permanent than remembrance. Physical devastation proves less complete than spiritual preservation. In scattered communities across the Roman realm, wherever Jews gather to mourn their losses and preserve their heritage, the temple continues existing in ways its builders never imagined. Each year, on the 9th day of Av, Jewish communities everywhere observe a fast commemorating the temple's devastation. They memorize its measurements with mathematical exactness, preserve its ritual patterns through careful examination, dream of its restoration with hope sustaining them through centuries of displacement. The temple's absence paradoxically makes it more powerful in Jewish consciousness than its presence ever was. The structure existing in history, with its political compromises and periodic corruptions, transforms into the temple of pure remembrance, perfect in holiness, complete in its service to God, eternal in its importance. Christians interpret the temple's devastation as confirmation of their master's prophecy, verification that the old covenant has yielded to the new. The structure's collapse represents not tragedy but transition, not divine abandonment but divine satisfaction of promises made through prophetic voices. The author of the letter to the Hebrews, composing either shortly before or after the temple's devastation, articulates this Christian comprehension with theological exactness. Christ has entered not a sanctuary constructed with hands, but heaven itself, presenting not repeated animal sacrifices, but his personal blood once for all time. For Christians, the temple's devastation demonstrates that the new covenant has rendered the old obsolete. The physical structure was always intended to be temporary, a shadow indicating toward the reality that Christ embodies. His death and resurrection accomplished what temple sacrifice could never achieve: permanent reconciliation between God and humanity. Muslims, when their faith surfaces from Arabian deserts centuries later, will claim this identical mountain for their personal religious objectives. The rock where Abraham offered Isaac, where David constructed his altar, where Solomon's temple stood in magnificence, becomes the foundation for the dome of the rock, still crowning the Temple Mount. 3 faiths, 1 mountain, 3 different comprehensions of what transpired here. 3 competing assertions on sacred location, 3 distinct interpretations of divine intention. Judaism mourns what was destroyed. Christianity celebrates what was satisfied. Islam honors what was transformed. The temple's physical devastation becomes the starting point for its spiritual multiplication. What commenced as one structure in one city becomes innumerable synagogues preserving its remembrance, countless churches proclaiming its satisfaction, and mosques honoring its importance across the Islamic realm. Every synagogue constructed after 70 CE carries architectural elements, recalling the temple's design. The ark holding Torah scrolls echoes the Holy of Holies. The eternal flame remembers the menorah's illumination. The elevated platform mirrors the historical altar. Jewish worship preserves temple patterns even in temple absence. Every Christian church claims to be the temple's successor, not in architectural terms, but in spiritual reality. Paul's letters speak of believers' bodies as temples, Christian communities as God's dwelling place, the church, universal, as the dwelling God constructs from living stones instead of dead rock. The temple that was devastated continues existing in human hearts seeking the sacred, in communities assembling for worship, in faith transcending the constraints of geography and architecture. Its influence spreads far beyond the borders of historical Palestine. Its significance resonates through cultures that never heard of Solomon or Herod. The account, commencing with one monarch's dream of constructing a dwelling for God, concludes with the recognition that God's true dwelling place was never restricted to structures constructed by human hands. The temple's greatest achievement was not its architectural magnificence, but its success in teaching humanity that the divine presence cannot be contained by any earthly building. In the end, the Temple of Solomon stands forever, not because of what was constructed, but because of what was believed, not because of the stones that were positioned, but because of the faith that was kindled, not because of the gold that gleamed, but because of the hearts that sought the sacred. The dwelling place of God was always intended to be discovered, not in structures made with hands, but in souls surrendered to divine love, not in temples constructed of stone and metal, but in communities assembled around shared hope, not in buildings that time can devastate, but in relationships that eternity cannot sever. The temple exists onward, transformed yet not diminished, satisfied rather than forsaken, present, wherever human hearts seek the divine presence that once filled Solomon's golden sanctuary with magnificence too brilliant for mortal eyes to endure.